You will hear heavy rain sound as I am hearing while driving, but it will calm down naturally. I'm Dev, and this is Shadowed Slumber. The storm outside is loud right now, but it won't last. Nothing does. That's the thing about time. It heals, it softens, it turns chaos into memory. And tonight I want to offer you stories that do the same. Strange tales that pull you out of your own head and let you rest. And look, I'm not here to beg for subscribers. But if what you hear tonight genuinely helps you sleep, helps you heal, then please hit that subscribe button, comment below, share it with someone who's struggling. Let's build something good here. Now let the rain settle and let's begin. Story 1. This is a real broadcast, real date, a real unsolved case underneath it. What I can't give you is an ending. Get comfortable. I'll see you after. On the afternoon of August 13th, 1997, a call screener working the phone banks for the Howard Stern show flagged a line for the host's attention with a note that, by every account of people in the studio that day, sounded like nothing special at all at the time. A caller was on hold who claimed he killed prostitutes. By the mid-1990s, the Howard Stern show had been broadcasting in syndication for the better part of a decade, reaching a national audience of several million listeners across dozens of markets, and had built its reputation on a specific, deliberately confrontational format that treated almost no subject as too vulgar, too personal, or too dark to put on air. Callers phoned in constantly to confess embarrassing secrets, argue with the hosts, prank the show, or simply try to say something outrageous enough to earn 30 seconds of a producer's attention before getting cut off. Stern himself had, by that point, weathered indecency fines, congressional scrutiny, and a reputation as the single most controversial figure in American radio, all of which had only ever seemed to grow his audience rather than shrink it. A career built, in large part, on the specific bet that listeners would rather be uncomfortable than bored, an irony that would sit uneasily over the clay call for decades afterward, given the word the caller himself would eventually offer as his own explanation. The show fielded calls like that more often than most listeners probably assumed. Shock value was the format's entire business model, and hoax calls claiming outrageous things were, if anything, part of the daily texture of the program, indistinguishable at the moment they came in from the 1,000 other calls that had promised something shocking and delivered nothing more than a bad joke. Stern took the call anyway. The way he took most calls that promised to be either genuinely interesting or genuinely stupid, usually unable to tell which, until the caller had already been on air for a minute or two. The man on the line first gave his name as Ed. Within the opening exchanges, he corrected himself, or perhaps simply switched personas, and asked to be called Clay instead. A detail that alone would have been enough to make any experienced radio producer assume they were dealing with a bit, a caller playing a character rather than describing his own life. That single inconsistency, the switch from one name to another within the first minute of the call, has been read two entirely different ways by people who've picked the recording apart over the decades since, as evidence of a hoaxer who hadn't quite settled on his own bit before going on air, fumbling the setup of a character he hadn't finished inventing, or, less comfortably, as the kind of small, unconscious slip a genuinely nervous person makes when giving a false name for the first time under real pressure, catching himself partway through and course-correcting to whatever alias he'd actually planned to use. Neither reading can be confirmed from the audio alone, and the ambiguity of that first 60 seconds turned out to be a fairly accurate preview of the ambiguity that would define every minute that followed it. Stern, who had built a career on being difficult to shock and even harder to fool, treated the call with the skepticism that instinct suggested. He pushed, prodded, threw out leading questions designed to catch a liar in the act. Asked whether Clay had been abused as a child, whether he'd had some formative trauma that might explain what he was claiming, the kind of pop psychology bait that a scripted prankster might have been primed to take. It was a technique Stern had used, by that point in his career, on plenty of callers whose claims turned out to be nothing more than an elaborate setup for a punchline, and there was no obvious reason, in the first minute of the call, to expect this one would play out any differently. Clay didn't take it. He said, in substance, that nothing like that had happened to him, that he hadn't been abused or neglected, that the honest explanation was simpler and considerably less satisfying than the one Stern seemed to be fishing for. He said he did it because he was bored, and he said it without any of the defensiveness or irritation a person might reasonably show when a stranger keeps trying to hand them an excuse they've already declined once, delivering the word with the same unbothered evenness he'd used for everything else on the call, as though boredom were simply the most efficient and least interesting answer available to a question he'd clearly been asked, in one form or another, more than once before that day. What followed, across the several minutes Clay remained on the line, has been described by nearly everyone who has listened to the surviving recording in the decades since as the single most unsettling stretch of audio the show ever put to air, not because of any single lurid detail, but because of the texture underneath all of them. Clay described killing women, primarily sex workers, in the New Orleans area over a period of years. He said his weapon of choice was a hammer. He described a general method of disposal, leaving bodies along roadsides and in isolated outdoor locations rather than concealing them carefully, and expressed something close to a hobbyist's mild disappointment that nobody in the press or the police had ever picked up on it as the work of one person, that he'd hoped at some point to draw enough attention to be recognized for what he'd built. He put his own total at 12. He never raised his voice, not once across the full length of the call, even when Stern's questions grew pointed enough that a genuinely invested prankster might have been tempted to lean into outrage or wounded pride to sell the bit further. He never seemed to reach for sympathy or justification or anything that resembled the performance of guilt or grievance. That both the hosts and the listening audience seemed to be unconsciously braced for throughout the call, the emotional beat that never came, and whose absence, more than anything Clay actually said, is what several longtime listeners have pointed to since, as the moment the call stopped feeling like a bit and started feeling like something else. The back and forth itself, stretched across what listeners have clocked at somewhere close to 7 minutes, followed a rhythm that several people who've studied the recording closely have compared to an interrogation neither man fully realized he was conducting. Stern, working from instinct rather than any formal training, kept circling back to motive, offering Clay an increasingly generous menu of explanations to choose from. A difficult childhood, a specific grievance against sex workers, some triggering event that might make the whole thing legible as tragedy rather than simple appetite. Clay declined every offer politely, almost apologetically, the way a person turns down a dish they don't particularly want at a dinner party. He said he'd had, by his own account, an unremarkable upbringing. He said nothing had happened to him. When Stern pushed harder, asking directly why anyone would do what he was describing, Clay's answer stayed essentially the same each time. It was asked in a slightly different way, that he found it interesting, that it filled time he otherwise wouldn't have known what to do with, that boredom, stated as plainly and without embarrassment as a man describing a hobby he'd picked up to fill his evenings, was the only honest answer he had to give. Robin Quivers, Stern's longtime co-host, has been quoted in interviews conducted years after the call aired describing her own reaction in the room that day as a mounting, wordless unease that she couldn't fully articulate to the audience in real time. The specific professional mind of a broadcaster whose instinct told her something was deeply wrong, while the format itself gave her no clean way to stop the segment, without also risking that the whole thing really was, as it seemed statistically more likely to be at the time, an elaborate joke. That tension between what her instincts were telling her and what professional caution about being played for a fool demanded has become, in retrospect, one of the most frequently cited details in every later retelling of the call, because it mirrors almost exactly the position every listener since has found themselves in, sitting with the same recording, unable to resolve the same doubt. The segment that followed Clay's call, according to people who've documented the show's full broadcast log from that week, was an ordinary one. A celebrity interview booked weeks in advance, unrelated in every way to what had just aired. The kind of jarring tonal whiplash that syndicated radio produced constantly, simply by the mechanics of a fixed schedule that couldn't pause for anything, however unusual. Longtime listeners who caught the broadcast live have described, in later retrospectives, a specific unease at hearing the show simply move on. Ad breaks and celebrity banter resuming within minutes of a man calmly describing a decade of murders, as though the format itself had no register available for what had just happened beyond treating it the same as everything else that had ever filled that same time slot. The show ended the call the way it ended most calls that had run their course, and moved on. There was no dramatic on-air reckoning, no immediate statement that the studio was contacting police, nothing that suggested, in the moment, that anyone in that room fully believed they'd just aired a genuine murder confession, rather than an unusually committed piece of shock radio theater. That reaction, in hindsight, is one of the details people who've revisited the tape in the years since keep coming back to. Not because it necessarily proves anything about whether Clay was telling the truth, but because it captures almost perfectly the exact ambiguity the call has lived inside ever since. Nobody in that studio treated it as an emergency, because shock radio had trained everyone in the building, hosts and audience alike, To expect exactly this kind of claim, and to disbelieve it by professional reflex. If Clay really had done what he said he'd done, that reflex, the specific, practiced skepticism of an audience that had heard 1,000 callers claim 1,000 outrageous things, may have been the single best piece of cover he could have asked for. A kind of protection built entirely out of the format's own jaded expectations, rather than anything he had to engineer himself. The reason the call has never simply been filed away as an elaborate prank is that New Orleans, in the years immediately before it aired, had a real and terrible pattern sitting underneath it, one that made Clay's claims land with a specificity a purely invented hoax would have had every incentive to avoid. Between 1991 and 1996, at least 26 women were found dead in and around New Orleans, most of them in canals, ditches, and swampy overgrowth off highways ringing the city, bodies left in water and isolated brush that accelerated decomposition and destroyed much of the physical evidence that might otherwise have connected the cases to one another or to a single perpetrator. The victims were disproportionately black women and transgender women who worked, or were believed to work, in street-level sex work, a population that in the New Orleans of that era received markedly less urgency from investigators and markedly less coverage from local press than a comparable string of killings targeting almost any other demographic would have received. A task force wasn't formally convened until 1995, years after the pattern had already claimed most of its victims, and even then, the region's own police leadership disagreed publicly, on the record, about whether the deaths were connected at all. One senior official stating plainly that investigators had never believed a single person was responsible, a position that put the department's own official stance directly at odds with the working theory that outside profilers and journalists had already converged on. The press, once it did engage, gave the killer a name that stuck, the Storyville Slayer, after the old New Orleans neighborhood, and by the time a sketch was circulated in 1992, built from witness descriptions, after the first several bodies had surfaced, the case had already taken on the specific, dreadful shape of a serial killing spree the city's own institutions had been slow to even name as one. For a period in 1995, suspicion fell on a New Orleans police officer named Victor Gant, whose girlfriend and her friend were both found murdered that year, one of them a woman believed to have been involved in sex work. Gant was investigated, reportedly submitted blood and tissue samples as part of that investigation, and was never charged with any crime connected to either death. He denied any wrongdoing throughout, remained at a desk assignment with the department during the period he was under scrutiny, and years later returned to departmental work in an evidence processing role after a civil service ruling concerning his employment status. Nothing in the public record connects him to the broader Storyville pattern beyond that single, unresolved period of scrutiny, and no charges were ever filed. It was against that backdrop a real ongoing, publicly disputed serial killing the city's own police department wouldn't formally acknowledge as connected. That a caller phoned a nationally syndicated radio show and calmly claimed responsibility for a body count that lined up, in its broad shape if not in exact number, with a case that was at that exact moment still actively unsolved. It's worth pausing on who the 26 women actually were. because most retellings of the Clay Call reduce them to a body count the way the caller himself did, and that flattening is its own quiet second injury on top of the first. Danielle Britton was found in a ditch in August of 1991, one of the earliest confirmed victims. Her death initially processed with little urgency by a department that, according to later reporting, treated the deaths of women with histories of sex work and drug use as a lower investigative priority, almost as a matter of unspoken policy. Rigida Martin, 29, was an impoverished mother of 3 with several prior arrests, found in a canal that September. Her family left for years afterward with no meaningful update on what, if anything, investigators believed had happened to her, a silence her surviving relatives have described, in the rare interviews any of them have given since, as its own separate and ongoing wound layered on top of the original loss. Cheryl Lewis, the victim whose death would eventually anchor the only conviction the case ever produced, was 30 years old and the mother of 4 children, reported missing in early February of 1993 and recovered from a canal near Hanville roughly 3 weeks later. Her remains in a condition that made even a basic cause of death difficult to establish with confidence. At least 2 of the documented victims, a nightclub performer who went by the stage name Brenda Bewitch, and another individual identified in some records under a name that may not have reflected how they lived, were transgender women, members of a community that in 1990s New Orleans faced compounding layers of institutional indifference on top of whatever bias already slowed the broader investigation, a compounding that later researchers examining the case have identified as a significant factor in why so many of the deaths went uninvestigated as a connected series for as long as they did. Dolores Mack, 42, was found in February of 1993 as well. Her case eventually charged against Russell Elwood alongside the Lewis killing before prosecutors dropped it ahead of trial for lack of sufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. None of these women chose the lives that made them, in the specific and ugly calculus of how some investigations get resourced and others don't. Easier for a killer to target without urgent consequence. Advocates who worked with sex workers in New Orleans during those years have said, in interviews conducted long after the fact, that the pattern of violence was an open, whispered fact inside their own community years before it ever became a story any outside institution treated with real seriousness, that women were quietly warning each other about a man, or men, working a particular stretch of road long before a task force existed to formalize what they already knew from experience. Some of those same advocates have pointed out, in the years since, that whoever was actually responsible for the pattern likely understood exactly how little institutional urgency their victims' deaths would generate, and that this understanding may have functioned as its own form of protection independent of anything as deliberate as evading forensic evidence. A killer, or killers, operating in the confidence that the specific women being targeted were, in the eyes of the systems meant to protect them, simply less likely to be looked for. That confidence, if it existed, would have been, by any honest accounting of how the case was actually handled in its early years, entirely well-founded. That gap between what a targeted community understood in real time and what the institutions meant to protect them were willing to act on sits underneath the entire Storyville case as its own separate and durable horror, one that exists independently of whatever the truth of the Clay Call ever turns out to be. The man most frequently connected to the Clay Call in the years since, though never through any confirmed legal link, is Russell Elwood, a former taxi driver and freelance photographer who had lived, at various points in the years leading up to the killings, out of his car when he couldn't afford anywhere else to stay. Elwood first drew police attention in 1994, years before his eventual arrest, when officers found him parked near a location where two of the Storyville victims' bodies had previously been recovered, partially undressed, offering an account of car trouble that didn't match the tools actually in the vehicle with him. The kind of detail that reads, in hindsight, like the beginning of a case file, and that at the time produced nothing more than a name added to a very long list of people worth a second look. Russell Elwood was born in 1946 in Massillon, Ohio, and by most accounts of people who knew him at various points in his adult life, lived an unsettled, transient existence long before anyone connected him to a single one of the Storyville deaths. Years working as a freelance photographer, stretches as a cab driver, periods of homelessness that put him, by his own routine and by the nature of the work, in close and repeated contact with exactly population of women who would eventually make up the case's victim list. That proximity on its own proves nothing. Plenty of New Orleans cab drivers in the 1990s spent their nights in exactly the same neighborhoods, without ever being connected to a single act of violence. But it's the kind of biographical detail that, once a name is attached to a case, retroactively takes on a weight it never carried, while the man was simply one more anonymous fare, pulling up outside a bar at 2 in the morning. Elwood wasn't arrested until March of 1998, 7 months after the Stern Call aired, when he was taken into custody after voluntarily returning to Louisiana from Ohio, and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. The killings of Dolores Mack and Cheryl Lewis, 2 women whose bodies had been recovered from canals outside the city years earlier. The Mack charge was dropped before trial, after the state determined it couldn't be sustained. The Lewis charge went forward, built largely on the testimony of women who said Elwood had assaulted or attempted to strangle them in years prior, and had never reported it at the time, afraid of not being believed, or of their own histories being used against them if they came forward, a pattern of delayed disclosure that defense counsel argued, unsuccessfully, made the entire case too unreliable to convict on. A jury found him guilty in 1999, and he was sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. His appeal, filed in the years after, argued the state's case rested on circumstantial testimony from witnesses, with their own credibility problems, and no physical evidence directly tying him to Lewis's death. The conviction was upheld. He remained, for the rest of his life, the prime suspect in as many as 15 of the broader Storyville killings. A number investigators were never able to formally attach to him, through physical evidence, strong enough to bring additional charges. He died in Louisiana's Angola State Prison in 2014, having never, as far as any public record shows, been asked directly by anyone with legal standing whether he had been the man who called himself Clay. The theory that Elwood was Clay has always had at least one detail working against its own tidiness. Records show he was arrested on a minor solicitation charge on August 4, 1997, just over a week before the call aired, which some who've examined the timeline have taken as evidence against the connection, and others have simply noted as an open question, since a minor arrest of that kind would not necessarily have kept him in custody through the middle of the month. Nothing about the timeline definitively rules him in or out. Nothing about it, 6 months of investigation and a life sentence later, ever definitively ruled him in either. What makes the clay call genuinely difficult to file away, even decades later, isn't any single piece of evidence pointing toward Elwood or anyone else. It's the specific quality of the voice itself, preserved on a recording that is circulated, re-uploaded, and rediscovered by new audiences roughly once a decade since it first aired, most recently finding an entirely new generation of listeners through short clips that spread rapidly online. People who listen to it cold, without any context about the Storyville killings at all, tend to describe the same handful of details afterward. The total absence of urgency in the man's voice, the way he answered even the most probing questions without hesitation or defensiveness. The sense that he was neither performing distress nor performing pride, simply reporting, in the tone of someone describing a task completed rather than a life taken. That flatness is, according to people who've spent actual professional time around the small number of documented killers who present the same way, one of the more genuinely unsettling profiles a caller can present, precisely because it resists the emotional shorthand true crime coverage usually offers an audience. A killer who rages, or who postures, or who performs some twisted version of remorse, gives a listener something to recoil from that still, in its own way, makes emotional sense. Cruelty as an extension of feeling, however monstrous the feeling. A killer who describes the same acts with the same even cadence he might use to describe a long commute offers nothing of the kind to hold on to. If Clay's account was genuine, what made it worse than almost any comparable confession on record wasn't the violence in it. It was the specific, total absence of anything resembling an interior life large enough to have generated that violence in the first place. A void where motive should have been, filled with nothing more than the single word he used to explain himself, which several people who've reviewed the recording since have called the most chilling detail in the entire 7 minutes. That he did it, because there had in his own accounting simply been nothing better to do. Criminologists who study documented cases of what's sometimes referred to as instrumental or thrill-oriented violence, pursued for stimulation or curiosity, rather than for anger, profit, or any grievance against a specific victim, have long noted that offenders in this category tend to describe their own crimes in strikingly procedural language, closer to a craftsman discussing technique than a person discussing an act with moral weight attached to it. It's a documented pattern independent of anything specific to the Clay recording, which is part of what makes the recording land the way it does. For listeners who've encountered that research, even in passing, Clay's account doesn't sound unusual, because it's an invented horror movie caricature of a serial killer. It sounds unusual because it maps with uncomfortable precision onto the way a real and rare category of documented offender has been shown, independently and repeatedly, to actually talk about what they've done. That category of offender is, by every serious study of it, genuinely rare. The overwhelming majority of documented homicides, including the overwhelming majority of cases involving multiple victims, trace back to more legible motives: intimate partner violence, robbery gone wrong, gang or drug-related conflict, grievance against a specific person or group. The specific profile Clay's account seemed to match, if it was genuine, belongs to a much smaller and much more unsettling category that true crime coverage vastly overrepresents relative to how often it actually occurs. precisely because it's the category audiences find hardest to look away from. There has always been a competing reading of the exact same evidence, and it deserves to be taken just as seriously. Stern's show had, by 1997, a well-established history of elaborate hoaxes, planted collars, and stunts designed to blur the line between genuine and staged content, specifically because that ambiguity was itself entertaining. Format thrived on an audience that could never be entirely sure what it was listening to, and a caller who understood that culture well enough could have built Clay as a character specifically engineered to exploit it. Using publicly available news coverage of the still unsolved Storyville killings as raw material for a performance rather than a confession. Details that make a hoax theory plausible include the fact that nothing Clay said on air couldn't have been assembled from local newspaper coverage available to anyone paying attention that summer. The hammer, the roadside disposal pattern, the general geography, all of it had appeared in press accounts of the Storyville killings before the call ever aired, meaning a sufficiently committed hoaxer wouldn't have needed any real knowledge of the crimes at all. Only a library card and a flair for a particular kind of dead-eyed delivery. Nothing about the call's content, taken purely on its own, proves the caller was anything other than a very good liar, drawing on the same public record everyone else had access to. It's worth noting, too, that the show had in the years, both before and after 1997, aired other calls claiming violence or criminal activity that were later determined through one means or another to be fabrications, regular callers with recognizable voices playing invented characters, planted bits coordinated in advance with the production staff, pranksters competing for airtime by escalating their claims past whatever the previous week's most outrageous caller had managed. Against that backdrop, a producer's default assumption on any given day, confronted with a caller claiming something this extreme, would reasonably have leaned toward performance rather than confession, simply as a matter of base rates built up over years of near-daily exposure to exactly this kind of claim. What makes Clay different, in the eyes of people who've spent real time comparing the recording against the show's other documented hoaxes, isn't any single verifiable fact. It's the specific absence of the tells that usually give a bit away. No laughter breaking through, no slip into a different register when a particularly outlandish detail lands, no moment where the caller seems to be enjoying his own performance rather than simply, flatly, reporting it. Skilled hoaxers exist. Few of them, according to producers who've spoken about the show's history of pranks in later interviews, ever managed to sustain that particular kind of effect for a full 7 minutes under direct, adversarial questioning from a host whose entire professional skill set was built around catching exactly that kind of performance in the act. The Howard Stern Show itself has never, in the nearly 3 decades since, offered a definitive public accounting of what the staff believed about the call at the time, or came to believe afterward, and Stern's own on-air reactions in the years immediately following give conflicting signals to anyone looking for a clean answer. Moments where he's referenced the call as one of the more disturbing things to have happened on the show, and other moments where the broader shock radio format he built his career on makes it genuinely difficult to separate a host's real unease from the same performed unease that sold advertising for 3 decades. No formal statement from the show's producers has ever confirmed that law enforcement was contacted in the immediate aftermath of the broadcast, and no public record has ever surfaced of an NOPD investigation opened specifically in response to it, a gap that true crime researchers who've tried to reconstruct the timeline have never been able to close. Whether that's because the call was quietly investigated and led nowhere, or because it was never seriously investigated at all, is itself one more piece of the story nobody has ever been able to nail down. The technical record is thinner than anyone chasing the story down today would like. 1990s call screening technology did not reliably preserve caller ID information the way modern broadcast systems do. And even where a number might once have been logged, no version of it has ever surfaced publicly in the nearly 30 years since. The show has fielded, by conservative estimate, tens of thousands of calls. In the years around 1997 alone, a caller determined to remain untraceable, using a payphone or a borrowed line in an era before that kind of caution required any real technical sophistication at all, would have had every practical advantage on his side, whether or not he had any idea, calling in, that he was creating something people would still be arguing about a generation later. There's also the more mundane possibility that the show itself, whatever its staff privately believed about the call's authenticity in the moment, had no institutional mechanism in place at the time for escalating a phoned-in claim to actual law enforcement, even if everyone in the room had wanted to. Radio stations in the 1990s were not built structurally or legally to function as investigative bodies, and producers whose entire professional training was in booking compelling content rather than evaluating criminal evidence would have had at best an informal and untested sense of what obligation, if any, they carried once a caller hung up and the next segment began. Several media ethics scholars who've written about the case in passing over the years have pointed to it as an early, uncomfortable example of a problem that talk radio and, later, true crime podcasting would keep running into for decades afterward. A format built to solicit exactly this kind of shocking disclosure, with no clear plan in place for what happens on the rare occasion the disclosure turns out to be real. The Storyville killings themselves remain, as a body of cases, officially unsolved beyond the single conviction secured against Elwood, who was never charged in connection with more than one of the 26 deaths investigators spent years trying, with limited resources and limited institutional urgency, to connect to a single hand. The task force that had been assembled to pursue the broader pattern was disbanded not long after Elwood's sentencing, its work folded quietly into the closed case pile, with a single conviction standing in unofficially for a resolution the wider case never actually received. Families of several of the other victims have said, in the years since, in the handful of interviews any of them ever agreed to give, that they were never contacted with any meaningful update after the initial investigation into their daughter's or sister's death went cold. that the word closure was one they'd stopped expecting to hear applied to their own case a long time before Elwood was ever arrested for someone else's. Elwood himself, in the years between his 1999 conviction and his death in 2014, gave few interviews of any kind from inside Angola, and none, as far as any surviving record shows, in which he was ever directly asked about a decades-old radio call under a name that wasn't his own. His trial focused narrowly on the physical and testimonial evidence connecting him to Cheryl Lewis's death, and the prosecution, by most accounts of people who covered it at the time, made a deliberate strategic choice not to introduce the stern call at all, aware that tying their case to an unverifiable radio confession risked undermining evidence that stood on its own without it. That prosecutorial caution has become, in retrospect, its own small piece of the puzzle, a signal that even the people with the most professional incentive to connect Elwood to Clay, sitting on more information about him than the public would ever see, apparently judged the connection too thin to risk building a case around. What official investigation the call itself ever received is, itself, one of the story's more frustrating gaps. If the New Orleans Police Department opened any formal inquiry into the broadcast at the time, no public record of it has ever surfaced, and repeated public records requests filed by journalists and independent researchers in the years since have returned nothing that confirms one way or the other whether the department treated the call as credible enough to pursue. It's entirely possible a quiet inquiry happened and simply produced no leads worth documenting further. In a department already stretched thin across 26 open cases and years of limited public pressure to solve any of them faster, it's equally possible nobody with the authority to open that kind of inquiry ever took the call seriously enough to try. Whether Clay was Elwood or a different, still unidentified man responsible for some or all of the same killings, or an entirely unconnected individual whose claims happen to land on top of a real pattern by grim coincidence, or simply a gifted and deeply disturbed liar who understood exactly how to construct a plausible boast out of details already circulating in local news coverage that summer, is a question that has now outlived one of its two most likely subjects. The recording has taken on a life of its own that has, in some ways, outgrown the specific facts of the case it's actually attached to. It's circulated for years on physical dubs and bootleg cassette compilations of the show's most notorious moments, the way a lot of pre-internet radio infamy did, passed between fans who'd recorded it off the air and shared it the way people once shared any piece of media too strange to fully explain secondhand. It found a second life on early internet forums in the 2000s, a third on YouTube uploads that would periodically get taken down and periodically resurface under a new title, and a fourth, most recently on short-form video platforms where clips of the call, stripped of almost all the surrounding context about the Storyville killings, have introduced an entirely new and considerably younger audience to 7 minutes of audio that most of them have no way of evaluating against the actual documented history sitting underneath it. Comment sections under those clips read, consistently, like a live version of the exact same argument that's been running since 1997. Some viewers certain it's obviously fake, some certain it's obviously real, almost nobody landing anywhere in between with any real confidence, and almost nobody, judging by the comments, aware that a real man really was convicted of killing at least one of the women whose deaths the call's content so closely resembles. That gap between a piece of audio that gets discovered and rediscovered purely as a spooky curiosity, and the actual women whose real, still largely unsolved deaths gave that audio whatever grounding in reality it has, is its own quiet postscript to the whole story. A researcher who spent several years cataloging the Storyville case for an independent true crime archive has noted, in one of the few pieces of serious long-form writing the case has ever received, that the Clay recording is very likely the single most consumed piece of media connected to the killings by a wide margin, heard, at this point, by vastly more people than have ever read a single article about Cheryl Lewis, Dolores Mack, Danielle Britton, or any of the other women whose names appear in the case files the recording is, however loosely, actually about. That imbalance isn't anyone's fault in particular. It's simply what happens when a 7-minute audio clip is more shareable, more algorithmically rewarded, and considerably less demanding of an audience's attention than the years of patient, underfunded investigative work that produced the only conviction the broader case ever saw, a mismatch that has only accelerated in the years since short-form video turned the recording into something closer to ambient internet folklore than a piece of evidence anyone still treats as connected to an active, unresolved set of real deaths. The women remain, in the story as most people now encounter it, a body count recited by a calm voice on a phone line, rather than 26 individual lives that ended in exactly the kind of violence and exactly the kind of institutional indifference that made up hoaxers or a killer's confidence that he'd never be caught entirely reasonable to hold. Elwood took whatever he actually knew about that phone call to his grave in 2014, and Stern's show has never produced anything resembling a resolution beyond the recording itself, which remains exactly as ambiguous today as it was the afternoon it first aired. A voice on a landline, calm and unhurried, describing something no one has ever been able to fully confirm or fully dismiss, still circulating, still being discovered for the first time by listeners who weren't alive when it happened, still ending, every single time it's played, on the same unanswered question it started with. Story 2. Cole Marchetti was 16 years old, a junior at Ashwood Prep, and the kind of kid who fixed things, small engines mostly. A go-kart he and his dad had rebuilt from a frame they'd found at an estate sale. The lawnmower 2 neighbors down the street brought over every spring, because Cole did it for the cost of parts and a genuine interest rather than money. His father, Mark, ran an HVAC repair business out of a garage 2 towns over, and Cole had spent enough Saturdays riding along on service calls as a kid that fixing things had become less a hobby than a kind of family language. The way some households bonded over sports or church, and the Marchettis bonded over the specific satisfaction of getting something broken to work again, a language that would end up carrying an especially bitter weight in the weeks after his death, when the thing that had gone wrong turned out to be exactly the kind of mechanical failure Cole would ordinarily have been the first person in the family to want to understand and fix himself. He worked Saturdays at a hardware store, had a girlfriend of 4 months he was still visibly delighted by in the specific unguarded way 16-year-olds are before they've learned to perform coolness about it, and played trombone in the school's marching band with the specific mediocre enthusiasm of a kid who joined for the friends rather than the music. His younger sister, Ava, was 12 and idolized him in the straightforward, unembarrassed way younger siblings sometimes do before adolescence teaches them to hide it. Following him around the garage on weekends asking to hand him tools, whose names she was still learning. On the Tuesday afternoon that would end up mattering more than any other afternoon of his life, he asked his mother, Denise, to drop him at school 40 minutes before the buses usually ran, so he could grab his marching gear from the family's minivan before the after-school rehearsal. She remembers the drop-off as entirely unremarkable. A quick hug across the console, a reminder that she'd be back to pick him up after practice. The specific mundane texture of a Tuesday that neither of them had any reason to believe was different from any other Tuesday that year. The van was an older Honda Odyssey, third-row seats that folded flat into the floor when you weren't using them, a mechanism that had worked fine for 6 years of hauling groceries and hockey gear. And on one memorable occasion, a full-size mattress somebody had left on the curb that Cole's dad had decided, against all reasonable advice, was worth saving. Cole's trombone case and his uniform garment bag were stored back there, wedged behind the folded third row. And getting to them meant reaching over the seat back and hauling the flattened bench up into its full upright position, a task he'd done a dozen times before without incident, using the same manual release lever every other Odyssey owner in America used to do the exact same thing. The lever caught wrong. Nobody, in the weeks of investigation that followed, was ever able to reconstruct exactly how, whether Cole had pulled it at an angle the mechanism wasn't designed for, or whether some small manufacturing defect in that specific seat assembly had finally failed after 6 years of ordinary wear. But the result was straightforward, and within about 90 seconds, completely irreversible on his own. The heavy folded seat pivoted up and back with far more force and far less control than it was supposed to, catching Cole across the lower body as he leaned in over it, pinning him at an angle between the seat back and the van's rear cargo wall in a space that gave him almost no leverage to push back against it. He was a strong, athletic 16-year-old. The seat, fully engaged in the wrong direction, outweighed anything he could produce with his arms alone from the position he was stuck in. The first 30 seconds, by his own account on the recording of the call he made almost immediately after, were spent simply trying to understand what had happened, the specific disorientation of a body, suddenly restrained in a way it had never been restrained before. A teenager's instinctive first assumption that this was a problem he could solve himself if he just found the right angle to push from. He tried twisting his hips. He tried bracing a foot against the wheel well and shoving upward with his shoulder. He tried reaching back for the release lever a second time, hoping whatever had gone wrong the first time might simply reset itself if he found it again, and found instead that the awkward angle of his own trapped body made it impossible to get more than his fingertips anywhere near the mechanism that had done this to him in the first place. He was somewhere in that second minute, the specific moment his own physical effort produced nothing but a fresh jolt of pain through his lower back, and no actual give in the seat at all, that the calculation in his head visibly shifted on the recording. From "I can fix this myself" to "I need someone else to fix this." The exact instinct, as it happened, that his whole life, up to that point, had never really needed to develop. Because up to that point, almost everything mechanically wrong in Cole Marchetti's world had been a problem his own 2 hands were enough to solve. He had his phone. That detail matters more than almost anything else in what happened next. because it meant Cole did the single correct thing available to him almost immediately. He called 911 at 3:24 in the afternoon, less than 2 minutes after the seat caught him. His voice already tight, with the specific compressed breathlessness of someone whose ribs were under real pressure. He told the dispatcher, clearly and in the right order, that he was trapped inside a minivan in the parking lot of his school. He gave the school's name. He described the van, silver, Honda, older model, and said he couldn't move his legs to reach the door or the horn, that the seat had come down on him, that he needed someone to come get him out. He was audibly scared without being incoherent. The specific controlled panic of a kid who understood correctly that giving clear information was his best chance, and was doing everything in his power to keep giving it, even as his voice kept catching on the effort of breathing against the weight across his body. He answered every question Priya asked him in order, without skipping ahead, without letting his own fear pull the conversation somewhere less useful. The same instinct, in miniature, that had made him good at fixing engines with his father on weekends. The belief that a problem described accurately enough was already halfway to being solved. The dispatcher who took that first call, a woman in her second year on the job named Priya Sethi, later told the internal review that Cole's composure was, if anything, part of what made the call read as lower urgency than it actually was. That callers in genuine crisis, in her training and in her 2 years of lived experience on the phones, more often sounded ragged, panicked, sometimes barely able to get a coherent sentence out, and that a caller who could still answer questions in complete, ordered sentences read, to an ear trained on that pattern, as someone who likely had more time and more options than he actually did. It wasn't a judgment she made consciously in the moment. It was closer to a reflex built out of thousands of hours on the phones, the kind of pattern matching that made her genuinely good at the job on every ordinary day. And that, on this one specific afternoon, worked against the one caller who most needed her to read the situation differently than the pattern suggested. She asked him to confirm the school's address. Ashwood Prep sat on a campus with 2 separate parking areas half a mile apart, connected by a service road that most students, including Cole, referred to by an informal nickname, the back lot, that didn't appear anywhere in the county's official address database. A piece of campus geography no dispatcher screening a call from a panicked 16-year-old would have any obvious reason to already know. Cole, breathing hard, scared, and giving the location the only way he'd ever had reason to describe it, said back lot by the gym. The dispatcher, working from a screen that auto-populated addresses, based on keyword matches against county records, typed what she heard, watched the system return the school's single listed street address, and moved forward with that address without a follow-up question specific enough to catch the mismatch, a 5-second gap in an otherwise ordinary call that would turn out to be the single largest variable in whether officers ended up within sight of the van or a half-mile away from it. The call was logged correctly as a welfare check, a category covering everything from a car accident to a wellness concern about an elderly relative who wasn't answering their phone, a category so broad that the priority level assigned to it depended heavily on how the responding dispatcher's own judgment weighed the specifics of what they'd just heard. Cole had said trapped. He had said he couldn't move his legs. He had not, in the compressed, breathless first call, used the word emergency, because it hadn't occurred to a 16-year-old in the first 90 seconds of an unprecedented situation that, The word itself might be the lever that moved the call up the queue faster than the actual facts he was describing. The call went out to patrol as a standard welfare check, not a priority response. Entered into the dispatch queue behind two higher-coded calls already pending in the same district. Two officers, Patrol Officer Reyes and his partner, a rookie 6 weeks out of the academy named Officer Dubois, picked up the call 21 minutes after it came in. Itself not an unusual delay for a standard priority welfare check on a day when the district's other units were tied up on a multi-car accident on the interstate on-ramp 2 miles away. They drove to the address the system had auto-populated, the school's single listed street address, which put them at the front parking lot rather than the back lot Cole had actually described, a service road and a stand of trees away from where his van actually sat. What happened next has been reconstructed in painstaking detail from body camera footage that neither officer knew in the moment was going to end up being watched and rewatched by an internal review board, a city council committee, and eventually a courtroom. Reyes drove a slow loop through the front lot. Neither officer got out of the car. The lot at that hour held maybe 40 vehicles, none of them from where the patrol car was driving, presenting any obvious sign of distress. No visible person, no waving arms, nothing that read. From inside a moving vehicle doing roughly 10 miles an hour as an emergency in progress. Dubois, the rookie, has said in testimony since that something about the loop felt incomplete to him. Even at the time, a half-formed instinct he didn't have the standing, 6 weeks into the job, to act on over his training officers read of the scene. He mentioned, quietly, that there might be another lot on the far side of the gym. And Reyes, already easing the car back toward the exit, told him the address they'd been given was the address they'd been given, and that chasing down every informal nickname a caller might have used for a location wasn't a road any patrol officer could afford to go down on every welfare check without abandoning the rest of his shift entirely. It was, on its own terms, a defensible operational judgment. Dubois radioed back that the area appeared clear. Reyes, 6 years into a job that had taught him, not incorrectly in the vast majority of cases, that most welfare checks of this kind resolved themselves before officers ever arrived. A driver who'd already been picked up, a mistaken address, a call that had simply aged out, logged the scene as unfounded and cleared the call. Cole's van, silver, doors closed, windows up, sat a half-mile away and out of sight the entire time, in a lot the officers never drove through, on a 94-degree afternoon that was inside a closed vehicle with no air moving, already climbing toward triple digits. Cole called again at 3:37, 13 minutes after the first call. His voice noticeably different this time. Thinner, more effortful, the specific vocal fatigue of someone who had spent the last quarter hour working far harder to breathe than his body could sustainably keep doing. He gave the same information again, more urgently. He said he was still trapped, that nobody had come, that he was having trouble breathing, that it was really hot in the van. He asked the dispatcher, a different one this time, to please hurry, the last 2 words landing with a specific raw urgency that the first call, for all its clarity, had never quite reached. The second call was logged as a separate incident rather than connected to the first, a gap in the system's own linking protocol that meant the dispatcher taking the second call had no way of seeing, on her own screen, that officers had already been sent to an address that didn't match where Cole actually was, and had already cleared the scene as unfounded. She took his information again correctly. This time, he was clearer on this call, about which lot he meant, closer to real panic, and further from the composed clarity of the first call, but somehow more specific about the location, the particular desperation of a kid repeating himself in every way he could think to try. And this second call, coded with slightly more urgency, given his description of breathing difficulty, went back out to patrol. It sat in the queue behind 3 other active calls in the district. The interstate accident still consuming 2 units. A domestic disturbance call that had just come in rated as higher priority than a callback welfare check on a location. Officers had already, according to the system, checked and cleared once already that afternoon. Nobody at any point in that chain made a decision that would have looked in isolation like negligence to the person making it. The address auto-populate function was doing exactly what it had been built to do. Officer Reyes's decision to clear the front lot as unfounded was a reasonable read of what he could actually see from a moving patrol car on a call that hadn't been flagged urgent. The second dispatcher's inability to see that the first call had already generated a response was a known limitation of the county's decade-old computer-aided dispatch system, one flagged in an internal report 18 months earlier, and never funded for the upgrade that would have fixed it, a line item that had competed in that year's budget cycle against a dozen other departments' equally reasonable requests, and had lost the way unglamorous infrastructure spending on a system that had never yet visibly failed almost always loses against requests with a more immediate, more politically visible payoff. Every single link in the chain was a person or a system doing something explicable, even defensible, given what they knew in the moment they were making the decision. The horror of what happened to Cole Marchetti was never a single failure. It was 6 or 7 small, individually forgivable ones, arriving in exactly the wrong order, at exactly the wrong speed, around a 16-year-old who had done every single thing right and had no way to make the system move any faster than it was built to move. Inside the van, the 40 minutes between the second call and the third were, by any reconstruction anyone has ever been willing to put into words, the worst of Cole's life, and it's worth resisting the urge to look away from that fact even briefly, because looking away from it is exactly the kind of institutional flinch that let the afternoon unfold the way it did in the first place. He'd stopped trying to physically free himself somewhere before the second call, his body having made the calculation his mind hadn't yet fully caught up to. That continued struggling was burning air and energy he needed for breathing, rather than producing any actual progress against the seat. He was sweating through his marching band polo within the first half hour, the interior of the van by then well past 90 degrees and climbing, no airflow of any kind, reaching the trapped angle of his body, his own breathing growing shallower, not from panic alone, but from the simple mechanical fact that the pressure across his ribs made a full breath cost more effort than a partial one, and a body running short on air, under stress, in rising heat, begins making exactly the kind of small economizing trade-offs that feel reasonable in the moment and compound, over an hour, into genuine physiological crisis. The interior temperature of a closed vehicle on a 94-degree afternoon climbs faster than most people who haven't studied it would expect, and climbs faster still for someone pinned in a position that made it hard to draw a full breath, even before the heat started working against him independently. What the later investigation was able to establish, from the timestamps on both calls and the condition in which Cole was eventually found, was that the physical mechanism that killed him was very likely a combination the medical examiner's report described in careful, clinical language. Positional asphyxia, worsened progressively by heat exposure in an enclosed space, over a period that stretched, in total, past 2 hours from the moment the seat first caught him. He called a third time at 4:56, more than 90 minutes after the seat had come down on him. This call was shorter than the first two, his voice reduced to something closer to a whisper, each sentence broken by the effort of getting enough air behind it to finish the thought. He gave the location again, the correct one this time, described exactly, as precisely as a fading, exhausted 16-year-old could manage. A detail that people who've studied the case since have found almost impossible to sit with, that even at the very end, with almost nothing left, the specific instinct that had gotten him this far, giving good information clearly, was still the last thing his mind reached for. And near the end of that final call, in the last full sentence he was able to get out clearly, before the recording captures him losing the ability to keep talking at all, his voice dropped to something quieter than anything on either of the first two calls, and he asked the dispatcher to tell his mother that he loved her and that he was sorry in case he didn't make it out. He didn't elaborate on what he thought he had to be sorry for. Nobody who has ever listened to that portion of the recording has been able to offer an explanation for that single word that doesn't make the rest of the call harder to sit with rather than easier. The dispatcher on that third call, a 12-year veteran named Carol Ong, who would later tell an internal review board that she had never, in over a decade on the job, taken a call she thought about as often afterward as that one, stayed on the line with him for the full length of the call, kept her own voice steady, told him help was coming, told him to keep talking to her, kept him on the phone for as long as he was physically able to keep participating in the conversation at all. She flagged the call this time, in every way the system gave her to flag it. Highest priority code available. A direct radio call to dispatch supervision rather than routing it through the standard queue. A personal follow-up call to the district sergeant when she didn't get an immediate acknowledgement. It was, by every account of people who reviewed the case afterward, the single moment in the entire afternoon where the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. It was also, by the time it happened, already too late to matter. Officers reached the actual backlot at 5:14 that afternoon, following Carol On's escalated call, and a location description specific enough, this time, to leave no ambiguity about where to go. They found Cole's van within 90 seconds of arriving in the correct lot. He was unresponsive when paramedics reached him. He was pronounced dead at the scene a short time later, 2 hours and 9 minutes after his first call had come in. Denise Marchetti was still at work, 40 minutes away, when the call came that would end the rest of her life, as she'd understood it up to that point, and everything about the 6 weeks that followed. The funeral, the first devastating pass through his bedroom, the marching band's decision to retire his uniform number rather than reassign it, happened, for her, inside a fog she has described since, in the few interviews she's agreed to give, as something closer to watching her own life from several feet outside it than actually living through it in real time. Mark, Cole's father, has said less publicly than Denise about that period, and the one detail that has surfaced through a family friend who spoke to a local reporter on background is that he spent the first several weeks after the funeral quietly rebuilding from scratch the exact make and model of seat mechanism that had failed inside the van, not out of any plan to do anything with what he learned, but because taking something apart to understand precisely how it had failed was the only language of grief his hands had ever really known how to speak. Ava, 12 at the time and 13 by the time the settlement was finalized, stopped talking about her brother almost entirely for the better part of a year, according to the same family friend, and then, without any clear trigger anyone could identify, began keeping a small notebook of things she wanted to tell him, a habit her parents have never asked her to explain or stop. What eventually broke that fog for Denise, she said, wasn't the funeral or the sympathy cards or any of the expected machinery of grief. It was hearing the recordings. The county released the 911 audio 9 weeks after Cole's death, following a public records request from a local news outlet and a legal fight the county ultimately lost over whether the recordings could be withheld. Denise listened to all 3 calls exactly once, in a conference room with her attorney and a grief counselor present, and has said publicly that she has never listened to them again and does not intend to. That the version of her son's voice on those recordings, controlled and clear in the first call, thinner and more frightened in the second, reduced to almost nothing by the third, is not how she wants to remember the sound of him, and that she resents in a way she's struggled to fully articulate even to people close to her. That the recordings exist at all in a form the public can request and listen to. That the worst 2 hours of her son's life are now permanently a matter of public record anyone can access with the right paperwork. The county's internal review, completed 4 months after Cole's death, identified the specific chain of failures in granular, almost unbearable detail. The address auto-populate mismatch, the call linking gap in the decade-old CAD system, the priority coding that hadn't accounted for a caller's own inexperience at recognizing when to escalate his own emergency, the patrol protocol that allowed officers to clear a welfare check without exiting the vehicle. The review board's report ran to 81 pages, most of them procedural, dry, written in the specific flattened language of institutional accountability documents that managed to describe something genuinely devastating, without ever once sounding devastated, a tone Denise has said she found almost as difficult to read as the recordings themselves. The specific dissonance of watching her son's death get processed, appropriately and necessarily, into the same bureaucratic register that had failed to save him in the first place. Officer Reyes was suspended for 2 weeks and reassigned to a different district. The review found his individual decision reasonable, given the information available to him at the time, but concluded the department's protocols around welfare checks needed to explicitly require officers to exit their vehicle and visually confirm a scene before clearing it, a change implemented 8 weeks after Cole's death and never publicly credited in any official capacity to the specific incident that had made it necessary. Reyes gave one interview 18 months after the suspension ended, in which he said the case was the reason he'd eventually left patrol work entirely for a records and training role within the department. Not because anyone had pushed him out, but because he'd found himself on every subsequent welfare check for the rest of his time on patrol, unable to clear a scene from inside the car without the specific, intrusive memory of that one afternoon making him get out and look anyway. A compulsion that had started, he said, as trauma and had eventually just become how he did the job, right up until it became easier to train other officers to do the same thing from the start than to keep carrying it call after call himself. Carol On received a commendation for her handling of the third call, an honor, she has said, in the one interview where the subject came up, that she has never been able to feel proud of, since the thing she's being commended for is having done everything right at a point in the timeline where doing everything right no longer had anywhere left to matter. She kept working dispatch for 6 more years after Cole's death before transferring to a training role, where, colleagues have said, she became known for a specific, almost obsessive insistence on drilling new hires on exactly the sequence of failures in his case, using it every single time as the first thing any new dispatcher in that county ever learned about the job, not as a cautionary tale in the abstract, but as a specific named, thoroughly documented afternoon that she made sure nobody coming up under her ever got to treat as hypothetical. The county settled with the Marchetti family a little over a year after Cole's death, a settlement that included funding for a full replacement of the dispatch center's call linking software and a mandatory annual training module, now used in departments well beyond the one involved, built directly around the specific sequence of small failures that added up to what happened to Cole. A training module that, in an irony, nobody involved in building it seems to find easy to sit with, exists specifically because a 16-year-old did everything the training is meant to teach people to listen for, and the system still failed to hear him in time. The settlement amount was never publicly disclosed in full at the family's request, though court filings that did become public confirmed it included a specific, negotiated line item for the software replacement, rather than treating the entire figure as an undifferentiated damages payment, a structure the family's attorney later said had been Denise's idea specifically, her insistence that whatever the county paid needed to be at least partly earmarked for something that would actually prevent the same chain of failures from happening to somebody else's kid, rather than existing purely as compensation for something no amount of money could actually offset. Local news coverage of the case ran heavy for the first several weeks after the recordings were released, and then, in the way local news coverage of most stories eventually does, thinned out into occasional follow-ups timed to the review board's findings, the legislative hearing, the settlement announcement, each one generating a fresh, smaller wave of public attention before receding again, the story competing every time with whatever else had happened that particular news cycle for a share of an audience's genuinely limited attention. A regional true crime podcast covered the case in a 2-part episode roughly 18 months after Cole's death, an episode Denise has said she's aware of, but has never listened to, unable to bring herself to hear strangers narrate her son's last 2 hours as entertainment, regardless of how respectfully the hosts may have intended it. She's not wrong that the intention matters less than she might want it to. A story like Cole's, once it enters public circulation, stops belonging entirely to the family who lived it and becomes, to some degree, everyone's to retell. a genuine loss layered quietly on top of the original one. One more thing taken from a family that had already had the worst thing imaginable taken from them first. What makes the story difficult to file away, even years later, even after the policy changes, even after the training modules and the settlement and the 2-week suspension, is the specific and total absence of anyone to be angry at in a way that resolves anything. There was no dispatcher who ignored him. There was no officer who saw the van and drove past it anyway. Every person in the chain, questioned individually, gave an account of their own decision that held up, on its own terms, to genuine scrutiny, reasonable people doing a genuinely difficult job, under genuine time pressure, making decisions that were each, in isolation, defensible, and that killed a 16-year-old boy anyway, when stacked together in exactly the wrong sequence. Denise Marchetti has said, more than once, that she has spent years looking for the one person she's allowed to be angry at, the one decision that, made differently, would have brought her son home that afternoon, instead of 2 hours and 9 minutes too late, and that the genuinely unbearable thing about the case, the thing that outlasts even the grief itself on the hardest days, is that she has never been able to find one. There isn't a villain in this story. There's only a system built by reasonable people making reasonable choices that was never fast enough. In the specific afternoon it mattered most to move at the speed a scared kid trapped in a minivan actually needed it to move. There's a particular kind of horror in that absence that doesn't behave the way horror usually does. A story with a villain gives an audience somewhere to put its fear once the story ends. The man was caught or he wasn't, but either way, there's a shape to blame that a listener can carry out of the story and set down somewhere. A story where the antagonist is a decade-old software limitation and a reasonable read of an empty-looking parking lot doesn't offer that same discharge. The fear it produces doesn't resolve into anger at a person. It resolves, if it resolves at all, into a much less satisfying and much more persistent unease about every ordinary system a person relies on without ever testing it. The assumption, carried by nearly everyone, nearly all the time, that if something ever actually goes wrong badly enough to need it, the number you call, people who answer it, will move fast enough and coordinate well enough to reach you in time. Cole Marchetti did everything that assumption asks of a person in his position. He stayed calm. He gave clear information. He called back when help didn't come, and called back again. The assumption simply wasn't true that afternoon, for reasons nobody involved could have predicted, and nobody involved was willing to be dishonest about afterward. And that combination, total procedural honesty on every side, and a dead 16-year-old at the end of it anyway, is its own specific, modern, thoroughly unsupernatural kind of horror story. Local advocacy groups that formed in the years following Cole's death, made up largely of families who'd experienced their own smaller-scale versions of the same kind of dispatch confusion without losing anyone, pushed for, and eventually secured a statewide requirement that all counties standardize their address databases to include commonly used informal location names for large campuses and complexes, schools, hospitals, apartment developments with multiple numbered buildings, specifically so that a caller under duress, using the only language they'd ever had reason to use for a place, wouldn't be relying on a dispatcher's ability to correctly guess what they meant under pressure. Several of those families had their own stories, less catastrophic than Cole's, but sharing the same underlying shape: a delayed ambulance, a fire truck sent to the wrong side of a sprawling apartment complex, a welfare check that took 40 extra minutes to reach an elderly relative because of an address mismatch nobody had caught in time. And it was the accumulation of those smaller, survived versions of the same failure, laid alongside Cole's, that eventually gave the legislation the momentum a single tragedy, however devastating, hadn't quite managed to generate on its own. The requirement passed 2 years after Cole's death, following a legislative hearing where Denise testified, the only time she has ever spoken about the case in a setting that wasn't a private interview. Reading a prepared statement in a voice a local reporter covering the hearing described as remarkably steady until the final line, where it broke completely, and she had to stop for nearly a full minute before she could finish. The hearing room, by all accounts, falling into a silence. Nobody in it seemed willing to be the first to break. Cole's trombone was recovered from the van, still zipped in its case, exactly where he'd been reaching for it when the seat came down. His parents kept it. It sits, as of the last time anyone outside the family spoke publicly about it, in a case on a shelf in what used to be his room, unplayed. The marching band uniform beside it retired rather than reassigned. His number never given to another student in the 6 years since. A small, deliberate refusal on the part of a band director who never explained the decision to anyone and has never been asked to. Priya Sethi, the dispatcher who took the first call, left dispatch work entirely 11 months after Cole's death, a departure her supervisor at the time described, carefully, as unrelated to any disciplinary action. Since none had been taken against her, the review board's findings had characterized her handling of the first call as within the reasonable range of professional judgment. Given the information and training she'd had at the time, she has never given an interview about the case. A former colleague, speaking anonymously to the same reporter who covered the legislative hearing, said Priya had told her once, in the break room, not long before she resigned, that she replayed the first call in her head almost every day. Not because she believed she'd done anything wrong exactly, but because doing everything defensibly right and still ending up on the wrong side of a 16-year-old's death was a weight she'd discovered. In the months afterward, she simply didn't have anywhere to set down. Denise has said, in the most recent of the handful of interviews she's given, that the thing she wants people who hear about her son's case to take away from it isn't outrage. Exactly. Though she understands why outrage is the reaction most people land on first. What she says she actually wants is something closer to attention. The specific, sustained kind of attention that a decade-old dispatch database or an underfunded call linking system will never get on an ordinary Tuesday, because on an ordinary Tuesday nothing has gone wrong yet, and the only thing that ever seems to generate the political will to fund the unglamorous infrastructure fix is the exact kind of afternoon that fix was supposed to prevent. She's said she doesn't know how to ask a county government, or any government, to spend real money fixing a system before it kills somebody, rather than after, and that the not knowing is its own separate grief, sitting on top of the one she started with. The fear which she has never been able to fully talk herself out of, that whatever changed because of what happened to Cole will eventually get quietly deprioritized again. The way the original upgrade request was, the next time budget season comes around and nothing has gone catastrophically wrong in long enough that the memory of why the fix mattered has started, gradually and understandably, to fade. She keeps his old bedroom door open now, which she didn't for the first year, and has said that the reason is small and doesn't really explain anything to anyone who hasn't lived through something like it. That a closed door felt, for a long time, like something being hidden, and an open one felt, eventually, like something simply being allowed to exist quietly in the house without anyone having to perform a feeling about it every time they walked past. Ava still writes in the notebook, less often now than she used to, and has told her mother, once, that she doesn't write things she wants to tell him anymore so much as things she thinks he'd find funny, which Denise has said is the closest thing to a sign of actual healing she's been able to point to in 6 years. Small and specific, and entirely her daughter's own, arrived at without anyone's help. Story 3. One more before I let you drift off. This one doesn't chase you, doesn't corner you, doesn't ask for anything at all. That's what makes it the one people write to me about most. Settle in. I'll be here after. I've spent most of my working life proving that other people's family stories aren't true. That's the polite version of what a professional genealogist actually does. People hire me because a grandmother said something once. We're descended from a duke. We had land taken from us in a flood. There's a curse on the men in this family who marry in June, and they want to know if it's real. And almost every single time, it isn't, not the way it got told. It's a grain of something true wrapped in 80 years of people wanting a better story than the one the courthouse records actually give them. I'm good at finding the grain. I've built a whole career on being the person who tells families their ghost stories are actually just a misfiled deed or a stillbirth nobody wanted to talk about at the dinner table. My wife, Mara, used to joke that I'd ruined my own kid's Christmas by fact-checking Santa Claus's supply chain, if given half a reason to. I'm telling you that up front, because it matters for what happened next. I didn't believe it. I want to be honest, that even now I still don't fully believe it, not in the sense of having decided anything. I just ran out of paperwork that explained it, and I've never once in 19 years of this work run out of paperwork before. We were driving from Pittsburgh to my grandmother's place, outside a town called Hollows Bridge, up in the Alleghenies. For what we all understood without saying out loud was probably the last summer she'd be well enough to have the whole family up at once. My side of the family had been in that stretch of mountains since the 1820s, farming a valley that didn't really support farming, which is its own kind of family story I'd spent a fair amount of my career quietly confirming and mostly not enjoying. My daughter, Wren, was 6, buckled in the back next to our dog, a soft-eared mutt named Baxter we'd pulled out of a kill shelter 4 years earlier, and who had in that entire time never once so much as growled at a person. Baxter didn't have an aggressive bone in him. He'd let toddlers put fingers in his ears at the dog park. He barked maybe twice a year, both times at the vacuum cleaner. We'd left Pittsburgh a little after 9 that morning, later than we'd planned, because Wren had insisted on bringing a shoebox of rocks she'd been collecting all summer to show my grandmother, and packing it properly had turned into its own small production. Mara drove the first stretch while I sat in back working through the last of a client file on my laptop. A family in Ohio convinced they were connected to a minor Revolutionary War officer, which they weren't. Not through the line, they thought, though there was a genuinely interesting bigamy case 4 generations back. I hadn't figured out yet how to break to them gently. Wren spent most of the first 2 hours narrating an elaborate story to Baxter about a kingdom of dogs, which he received with his usual patient indifference, chin resting on his paws, tail giving the occasional thump whenever she said his name. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, unprompted, in the specific way kids surface things that have been sitting in them for a while, Wren asked whether Grandma Ruth still talked to the man who tips his hat. I remember Mara glancing at me in the rear-view mirror, half a smile, because it was one of those family phrases that had drifted down to the grandkids the way certain things do, secondhand and mostly decorative, repeated at holiday dinners without anyone quite explaining what it meant or where it came from. I told Wren I didn't know, which was true, and that it was just one of Grandma Ruth's stories, which I believed at the time. My own mother used to roll her eyes at it, good-naturedly. The same eye roll she gave the Duke story and the flood story. One more piece of family color nobody took seriously enough to actually ask my grandmother to explain in detail. I'd looked into all 3 over the years, the way I looked into everything. Half professional curiosity, half a compulsion I never fully examined, and come up with nothing on any of them. I'd filed the Hat Man alongside the rest, a piece of inherited texture with no paper behind it, and hadn't thought about him again until that afternoon. We stopped around the middle of the afternoon at a rest area called Emberlyn Gap, a little turnout off the state route with a single low building, a row of picnic tables under a stand of pines, and a historical marker nobody ever seemed to read, commemorating a rail depot that used to sit on the same ground before the line got pulled up sometime in the 1950s. I remember thinking, in the idle way you think things on a long drive, that the whole rest area was probably built more or less on top of wherever the old depot platform used to be, because the parking lot had that flat, too deliberate shape old rail grades leave behind even after everything on them is gone. There was one other vehicle in the lot when we pulled in, or at least that's what I thought at the time, though I'd come to doubt it later. A man was sitting on the far end of one of the picnic tables, not eating anything, not doing anything, just sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him, watching the lot. I want to describe him carefully, because I've thought about how to describe him more than I've thought about almost anything else that's happened to me as an adult. He was dressed wrong for the day, and wrong in a specific way that took me a second to place, because at first my brain just filed it under old-fashioned without doing the work to say old-fashioned how. He had on a dark wool vest over a collarless shirt buttoned to the throat, sleeves held with a pair of thin metal garters above the elbow, the kind of thing I'd only ever actually seen in photographs. The exact kind of photographs I handle for a living, courthouse portraits and family Bibles from the turn of the last century. His trousers were held up with suspenders rather than a belt. He had a hat sitting on the table beside his folded hands, dark felt, narrow brim. The kind that had a specific name I could have told you if you'd asked me in a research context, and couldn't quite retrieve, standing in a parking lot, looking at one actually being worn. It was 91 degrees out. He wasn't sweating that I could see. I noticed, before anything else registered as wrong about him, that the lot around us was empty in a way that felt slightly off for the middle of a Saturday afternoon, on a route that saw a fair amount of summer traffic. No other cars, no trucker stretching his legs, no family like ours letting a kid run off energy at the picnic tables. I filed that under nothing much at the time, the same idle way I'd filed the historical marker and the shape of the lot. One more small, true detail sitting quietly in the day, waiting for a reason to matter. His face was the part I've had the hardest time holding on to. Not because it was blurred or strange-looking in any dramatic way. If anything, it was almost too ordinary. An older man's face, deep lines around the mouth, gray at the temples under the hat. But because he was looking at exactly nothing the whole time we crossed the lot, a flat, unfocused stare aimed at some middle distance that had nothing to do with any of us, right up until it did. The pines behind him didn't move, though there was enough of a breeze that afternoon to stir the flag over the picnic shelter and set the historical marker's little chain rattling softly against its post. And I remember noticing that too, in the same idle filing it away way, without understanding yet why it would matter later. Mara took Wren toward the building. I took Baxter around the picnic tables to let him do his business before we got back in the car, which put me within maybe 15 feet of the man, close enough to nod the way you nod at a stranger you're sharing a public space with. He didn't nod back. His eyes moved to me, actually moved, tracked me. The first real motion I'd seen from him. And he watched me the whole way past his table, head turning slightly to follow, and said nothing at all. I told myself, in the time it took to walk maybe 20 more feet, 3 or 4 different mundane things in a row, the way you do when something registers as slightly wrong, and you'd rather paper over it than look at it directly. There was a Civil War reenactment group that did events at a fort about 40 miles from here. I'd actually driven past a banner for 1 week earlier on a research trip for a client. Maybe he was part of something like that, dressed for an event, resting at a rest stop between wherever he'd come from and wherever he was going. People did stranger things for hobbies than that. It was a perfectly good explanation, and I believed it for almost the entire time it took Baxter to finish sniffing his way around the base of a pine tree, right up until Baxter went stiff. I've replayed what Baxter did next more times than I've replayed almost anything else in this story, because it's the part that doesn't have a version I can talk myself out of. He'd been loose and easy the whole walk, tail moving, nose down, doing what he always did in a new place. And then, all at once, with no sound or motion from the man that I could see triggering it, he stopped dead, every muscle in his body locked, and made a sound I'd genuinely never heard him make before. Not a bark, not a growl exactly, something lower and thinner than either, almost a whine except it had teeth in it. He put himself between me and the picnic table without my asking him to, hackles up in a solid ridge down his spine, and when I tried to move him along with a light tug on the leash, he didn't just resist. He fought it, all 90 pounds of him, digging his back feet into the gravel and throwing his whole weight backward so hard the leash handle nearly came out of my hand. I told myself one more mundane thing, because I still had a couple left in reserve, that he'd probably caught wind of another dog somewhere nearby, or a groundhog, or one of the picnic table's previous occupants had left food scraps that smelled like something territorial. Dogs did this. It didn't have to mean the man himself was the problem. That was when the man spoke. "It's good to see you again," he said. His voice didn't match the rest of him. Everything else about him had a kind of stillness to it, an economy of motion, but his voice came out strained, effortful, like a man talking around something caught in his throat, each word a size too big for the space it had to pass through. He said it plainly, without warmth exactly, but without threat either. The way you'd greet someone you hadn't expected to run into, but weren't unhappy to see. I did what I think most people would do, which is assume mistaken identity, and I said something like, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met," in the mildly apologetic tone you use on a stranger who's confused you for someone else. He didn't correct himself. He didn't look confused at all. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone you were disappointed, hadn't caught on yet to an obvious joke, and he said my name, not a name close to mine, my actual name first and last correctly in that same strained voice, and then after it quieter, "You favor him more than your father did." I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it's the thing I've had the least success explaining to anyone since. It wasn't fear, not yet, not fully. It was closer to the specific vertigo of hearing your own name said by a voice you don't recognize in a context where nobody should have had any reason to know it. The 91-degree parking lot, going very slightly unreal at the edges. The sense of a door opening onto a room you didn't know was attached to the house. Baxter, at that exact moment, broke his leash, not slipped his collar, broke the leash itself. A nylon lead, rated for dogs 3 times his size, snapped clean through the woven fabric near the clip, and he didn't run at the man. He ran the other way, hard, straight for the car, and stood at the passenger door shaking so violently I could see it from 30 feet off. A full-body tremor that didn't stop, even after I got him inside and shut the door. When I turned back around, the picnic table was empty. I want to walk through what happened in the next several minutes as carefully and as plainly as I can, because it's the part where I stopped being able to explain anything with the tools I actually have. I looked for him the obvious ways first. Up and down the row of pines behind the picnic shelter, along the low fence at the edge of the lot, toward the building where Mara and Wren had gone in, thinking maybe he'd simply walked off while I was looking down at the dog and I'd missed the actual motion of it. There was nowhere close by for a person to disappear to in the amount of time that had passed. The tree line started a good 60 feet back from where he'd been sitting. Open ground the whole way, nothing to duck behind. I checked the restroom building itself, walked the length of it, checked around back where a dumpster enclosure sat against the wall, empty except for the dumpster. I checked the historical marker, absurdly, as though there might be some gap in the ground behind it I hadn't noticed. There was no car in the lot besides ours. I want to be exact about this because I spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of time afterward trying to convince myself I'd simply miscounted, that there had been a second vehicle tucked at an angle I hadn't clocked when we pulled in, but Mara confirmed it independently, without my asking her leading questions, when we compared notes later that night. At my grandmother's kitchen table, she remembered pulling in and thinking, out loud, that it was nice to have the place to themselves. One vehicle, ours, a state trooper, happened to be parked at the far end of the lot, running radar on the highway beyond it. I hadn't clocked his cruiser on the way in, tucked behind the tree line at an angle, but he came over when he saw me walking the fence line looking visibly rattled, and I told him some abbreviated, sane-sounding version of a man acting strange. Dog got spooked, wanted to make sure everything was fine. He walked the lot with me. He checked the restroom, both sides. He radioed in a vague description, mostly for form's sake, I think. More to placate me than because he expected anything to come of it. And nothing did. No vehicle logged, leaving the lot in the window, before or after. Nothing on the one traffic camera, a mile up the road, that might have caught a car pulling out. He was kind about it, in the specific tired way. People are kind about things they've already quietly decided don't have an explanation worth chasing. Told me it happens sometimes out here. People showing up on foot from one of the old logging roads that fed into the state land behind the rest stop, gone again before anyone thought to ask where they'd come from. I asked him about the camera mounted over the building's entrance. A scuffed gray housing bolted above the doorway that I'd clocked on the way in without thinking about it. He looked up at it and let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Said the state had put in a whole batch of those a few years back at rest stops along this corridor, and half of them had never actually been wired to anything. Budget ran out partway through the contract, and nobody had gotten around to either finishing the job or taking the empty housings back down. He didn't know off the top of his head which category this particular one fell into, but he wasn't optimistic, and when he radioed it in anyway, the answer that came back a few minutes later confirmed it. No feed, no footage. A camera that had been watching an empty rest stop parking lot for 3 years without actually recording a single frame of it. I asked him to check the ground where the man had been sitting, and he did, more to humor me than because he expected anything, walking the length of the picnic table and crouching by the bench. The grass around every other table in that row had the flattened, browned-out look of ground that had been rained on and baked dry a dozen times that summer, worn thin by years of feet and coolers dragged across it. The patch directly under where the man had been sitting was different. Full, green, undisturbed. Grass blades standing upright, the way they do in a spot nobody's walked on in a long time. No impression at all where a grown man's boots would have rested for however long he'd been sitting there before we arrived. The trooper looked at it for a few seconds longer than he needed to, said something non-committal about drainage, and didn't crouch down again after that. I didn't believe any of the explanations he offered me, camera or footpath or drainage, and I don't think he entirely believed them either, not by the third one. I think he just needed something to say that would let both of us get back in our vehicles. Wren, for her part, had seen almost none of it. She and Mara had been inside the whole time, and by the time they came back out, I'd more or less pulled myself together. Told Mara a flattened version of events, in a tone I was trying hard to keep light for our daughter's benefit, and gotten everyone back in the car. Baxter didn't stop shaking until we were a good 10 miles down the road. He wouldn't take a treat from my hand, which had never once happened in 4 years. And he spent the rest of the drive pressed into the far corner of the back seat, as far from the window as the seatbelt harness would let him get, watching the glass the whole way like he expected to see something in it. Wren asked. Maybe 20 minutes later, in the offhand way kids ask things that turn your stomach to ice. Whether the man at the rest stop was Grandma Ruth's friend. I asked her what she meant. She said, with the specific patience kids use when they think an adult is being slow, that Grandma Ruth talked about a man who tips his hat. And wasn't that probably him, since he'd had a hat? My grandmother, Mara's mother-in-law, technically, though Wren had never made that distinction, had been telling a story for as long as I could remember about a man she called, always in the same phrase, the man who tips his hat. It was one of maybe a dozen bits of family lore I'd spent actual professional hours trying to run down and had never found a single documentary trace of, which put it, in my own private filing system, in the category of things I quietly assumed she'd either invented or absorbed from some source she'd long since forgotten and reworked into a memory of her own. She'd describe him the same way every time, in the same handful of phrases, sitting somewhere at the edge of family gatherings, watching, never speaking. Occasionally, this was the detail that had always struck me as almost too specific to be pure invention, tipping his hat to whoever noticed him, and then simply not being there anymore when you looked again. I'd never once connected it to anything real. I'd filed it, professionally and privately, next to the Duke and the Flood and the June Curse, one more piece of inherited family texture that made for a good story at a funeral, and didn't hold up to a single hour in a courthouse archive. I didn't tell Wren any of that. I told her I didn't know, and I meant it more literally than I wanted to admit at the time. We got to my grandmother's place a little before dinner, and I didn't intend to bring any of it up with her at all. She was 89, frail in a way that had accelerated hard over the past year, and the whole point of the trip was to not upset her. It was Wren who brought it up, matter of fact, over dinner, asking Grandma Ruth if the man who tips his hat had a name. My grandmother went very still, in a way that had nothing to do with her age. She asked, in a voice that had lost its usual conversational lightness entirely, where Wren had heard that phrase. And Wren said we'd seen him at a rest stop, and he knew Daddy's name. I watched my grandmother's face do something I don't have a clean word for. Not surprise exactly, because surprise implies not having expected something, and what crossed her face looked much more like recognition, the specific expression of a thing long anticipated finally arriving. She asked me, quietly, once Wren had been sent off to wash up what he'd looked like. I described him as precisely as I could. The vest, the garters, the hat, the strained voice. And she nodded slowly through all of it like I was confirming something, rather than telling her something new. And then she got up, moved slower than I liked seeing her move, and came back with a small tin box she kept photographs in, ones too old and too fragile for the albums. She found one and set it on the table without a word. It was a formal portrait, the stiff kind people sat for in the early part of the last century. A man standing beside a chair with one hand resting on its back, dressed exactly, detail for detail, in the clothing I'd just described. The vest, the garters at the sleeve, the narrow-brimmed hat held at his side rather than worn, because you didn't wear a hat indoors for a photograph even then. The face wasn't identical to the one I'd seen at the rest stop. Not in any way I could have sworn to under oath, but it had the same deep-set lines, the same set of the mouth, and something in the shape of it that made the resemblance feel less like a coincidence, and more like a fact I hadn't finished assembling yet. She told me it was her own grandfather, a man named Elias, who'd worked the rail depot that used to sit She said this with no apparent awareness that she was confirming something I'd only guessed at hours earlier. At a place called Emberlyn Gap, before the line closed and the depot came down, he'd gone missing, not died, not that anyone had ever been able to document, simply stopped being accounted for. Sometime in the winter of 1911, no body, no explanation the family had ever settled on. And the story that got handed down instead of an answer was that he'd been seen afterward, here and there, at family gatherings, at the edges of things, watching, tipping his hat to whoever noticed him, and gone again by the time anyone looked twice. I asked her, because I couldn't not ask, professionally reflexive even then, whether there was a death certificate, a probate filing, anything official at all. She said no, not one, not that anyone in 4 generations had ever managed to find, which was in 19 years of doing this work. The first time a piece of family lore had ever actually outrun the paper trail instead of collapsing the moment I went looking for one. She told it the way she told everything, unhurried, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never actually drank from. And I found myself doing something I almost never do with a client's family story, which is simply listening without reaching for a notebook. Elias had worked the depot for 11 years, she said. Agent and telegraph operator both. The kind of job that made him one of maybe 4 people in the valley who actually knew what was happening in the wider world before the newspaper arrived a day late. He'd married her grandmother, a woman named Susanna, in 1897. And by all accounts, it had been a good marriage, unremarkable in the way good marriages usually are in family stories. Which is to say, nobody bothered writing much down about it. The winter he disappeared had been a hard one, heavy snow through December, and the story that survived, third-hand, worn smooth by however many tellings, was that he'd walked out to check on a signal lamp at the edge of the yard during a storm and simply never walked back. Susanna had waited 3 days before raising the alarm, because a man not coming in from a storm right away wasn't unusual out there, and by the time anyone organized a proper search, the snow had covered whatever tracks there might have been to follow. They looked for a body, my grandmother said, not a man. Nobody out here in 1911 was fool enough to go looking for a man still walking around in that cold. But there wasn't a body either. Not that winter, not the spring after, not ever, near as anybody could tell. She said Susanna never remarried, lived another 40 years in the same house, and told her own children, when they were old enough to ask, that their father hadn't died, only left, and that he came back sometimes to look in on them, always at the edges of things, always gone again before anyone could get a straight word out of him beyond whatever he'd already said. I asked her, gently, whether Susanna might simply have preferred that story to admitting her husband was dead, the kind of thing grief does to people. And my grandmother looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I can only describe as patient disappointment, the specific look of someone who has heard the rational explanation many times before, and has stopped being interested in arguing with it. That's what your mother always said too, she told me. You're welcome to believe it. I did, for a long time. She didn't say anything else about it that night, and I didn't ask. The next morning, while Mara took Wren and my grandmother's ancient, patient cat into the yard to hunt for 4-leaf clovers, I drove out to the site of the old depot myself, mostly because I didn't know what else to do, with the specific restlessness that had settled into me overnight, the kind that used to send me into an archive at 9 at night when a client's file wouldn't leave me alone. The rail grade was still visible if you knew to look for it. A long, flat scar running through what was now somebody's hayfield, and at the edge of it, half swallowed by brush, scatter of foundation stones, marked where the depot building itself had stood, square cut and moss-grown, one corner still holding the rusted stub of an iron bracket that might once have anchored a signal lamp post. I stood there a while without doing much of anything, the way you stand at a place you've only ever heard about, trying to make the flat green field match up with a story in your head. I drove from there to the County Historical Society in the next town over, a converted Methodist church that kept irregular hours and an even more irregular filing system, and spent the better part of 2 hours with a volunteer archivist working through what little the town had from that winter. There wasn't much. A weekly paper that had folded in the 1940s, its surviving issues incomplete, water damaged in patches. But in an issue from the following spring, buried on an inside page between a notice about a church social and an advertisement for seed corn, I found 4 sentences under a small headline reading, "Search for Missing Depot Agent Concord." It said, in the flat-clipped style of the period, that the search for Elias, his full name given, matching my grandmother's exactly, had been formally called off after 5 months, that no remains had been recovered, that foul play was not suspected, and that the depot position had been filled by a replacement hired out of Altoona. That was the entire article. No further mention of him in any later issue I could find, no follow-up, no memorial notice, nothing. A man had simply been agreed upon, in 4 sentences, to be a matter that was now closed. The archivist, an older woman who'd clearly heard some version of this story before from other descendants over the years, mentioned almost in passing that Susanna's own diary had been donated to the society decades back by a cousin's estate, and pulled it for me without my having to ask twice. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a farm diary of that era. Weather, illness, the price of things. But scattered through the years after 1911, in the same careful hand, were short entries that didn't fit the rest. Seen at the fence again this evening. He tipped his hat and I could not find my voice to answer. Or, 3 years later, the children saw him at the church social. He asked why grandfather wore such old clothes. I told her it was a joke among the grown-ups. The last entry that mentioned him at all was dated 1938, 27 years after he disappeared, and read only, "Still the same age. I am not. I don't have an ending for this, the way I'd want to give you one. I've since spent real hours, professional hours, the kind I bill people for when it's their family instead of mine, trying to find anything at all documenting Elias's disappearance. And I've found exactly what my grandmother told me I'd find, which is nothing. No death record, no burial. A single 1910 census entry with his name on it, and then nothing after. The kind of silence in the paper trail that usually means a family moved, or a name got misspelled into unfindability, except every other trace of every other relative on that same page continues on for decades afterward, without incident. He's the only one who simply stops. I told my grandmother what I'd found at the Historical Society before we left that Sunday, half expecting her to be shaken by it the way I still was. She wasn't. She listened to the whole thing with the same patient stillness she'd had at the kitchen table 2 nights before. And when I finished, she only nodded, like I'd confirmed a weather report, rather than a dead woman's diary, describing her husband unaged across 3 decades. "I know," she said. "I've known since I was younger than Wren. She told me she'd stopped being frightened of it a long time ago, that somewhere in her 89 years, it had settled into something closer to comfort than dread. The idea that some part of a person could stay tethered to a family for that long, watching, tipping his hat, asking nothing of anyone. I didn't tell her what Baxter had done, or how it had sounded, or what it had felt like, standing 15 feet from him, hearing my own name in that strained, effortful voice. I didn't think it would change her mind, and some part of me didn't want to be the one to try. Baxter wouldn't go near the car for 2 days after we got home, and it took the better part of a month before he'd sit in the back seat, without pressing himself into the far corner. He still won't settle at rest stops the way he used to. Any rest stop, anywhere, on any drive, going stiff and low the second we pull in, like he's checking the tree line before I've even got the door open. Ren asked me, weeks later, completely without prompting, in the car, apropos of nothing, whether the man at the rest stop had waved back at her. I hadn't told her he'd looked at either of them at all. I'd been careful, I thought, to keep the whole thing contained to what had happened between me and Baxter, 15 feet from a picnic table, while she and Mara were inside a building with the door shut. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, what she meant, and she said, in the tone kids use for something so unremarkable it barely merits mentioning, that she'd seen him through the restroom window while she was washing her hands, and she'd waved, the way you wave at anyone, and he'd tipped his hat back at her, and then she'd stopped being able to see him in the glass. I didn't push her on it. I'm still not sure I want the rest of that conversation, whatever it would have told me. I still do this work. I still spend most of my days telling other people, gently, that their family's ghost story is actually a misfiled deed or a name lost to a bad transcription somewhere around 1880. I believe that, in every case but one, and I've stopped being entirely comfortable saying it out loud the way I used to, with the flat certainty I used to enjoy having. I know exactly how that sounds coming from someone in my line of work. I've made my peace with how it sounds. I haven't made my peace with anything else. We drive up to my grandmother's twice a year now, instead of once, more often than the distance really justifies, because none of us have said out loud how much longer we think she has, and none of us want to be the one who didn't come enough. I've started taking a different route the last 2 trips, 40 extra minutes out of the way, that avoids Emberlin Gap entirely. I've never explained why to Mara. I don't think I need to. She takes the same route without being asked, and neither of us has said his name in the car since that first drive home. Not once, not even when Ren brings it up, which she still does. Every so often, the same easy, unbothered way she'd ask about any relative she'd only ever heard about secondhand. 6 months after the trip, going through a box of my grandmother's things she'd asked me to help sort through. She'd started, without announcing it, giving pieces of the house away in advance. I found a second photograph tucked behind the one she'd shown me at the kitchen table. One I don't think she knew was there, judging by how surprised she looked when I held it up. It was newer, decades newer, a family gathering from sometime in the 1970s, judging by the clothes. A wide shot of a backyard full of relatives I mostly didn't recognize. At the very edge of the frame, half cut off by the border, stood a man in a dark vest and a narrow-brimmed hat, hands folded, watching the camera the way you watch something you have no particular interest in being photographed by. Nobody in the shot seemed to be looking at him. Nobody seemed to have noticed him standing there at all. My grandmother took the photograph from me without a word, looked at it for a long time, and then put it back in the box exactly where I'd found it, face down, and asked me to help her carry the rest of the boxes out to the car instead. I didn't ask her anything else about it. I still have the photograph. I haven't decided yet what I'm supposed to do with it, or whether doing anything with it at all is the kind of question this particular family story was ever going to let me answer. Sometimes, working a client's file late at night, I catch myself looking a little longer than I used to at the edges of old photographs they've sent me. The blurred figure at the back of a wedding party, the stranger half cropped out of a church picnic nobody in the family can name. I used to skip past those without a second thought, background noise in somebody else's archive. I don't skip past them as quickly anymore. I tell myself it hasn't changed how I do the work. I'm not sure that's entirely true, and I'm not sure anymore that I'd want it to be. Story 4. This is a true story. Some names and details here have been changed. I'll explain why after, if you want to know. For now, settle in. Special Agent Grace Okafor had worked missing persons cases for the FBI's Violent Crime Squad for 11 years, by the time the Nawak file landed on her desk, and she'd learned, over those 11 years, that the cases which turned out worst almost never announced themselves as such in the first 72 hours. They looked at the start like the ones that resolved themselves. A young woman who'd taken a call from a rideshare app that wasn't actually the rideshare app, gotten into a car that matched close enough to the description on her screen that a person in a hurry, in the dark, in a country not her own, wouldn't have thought twice about it. That was the shape of the Nawak case from the very first briefing. And it was the shape Grace had learned the hard way to be most afraid of, because a stranger's car meant no digital trail worth trusting, no known relationship to lean on, nothing but a description of a vehicle and a young woman who had simply stopped existing in the world at 2:11 in the afternoon on a Friday in October. Kasia Nawak was 26, a visiting doctoral researcher from Poland, finishing out a 2-year fellowship in agricultural economics at Bellwood University, a mid-sized state school in a college town called Ashford that most people outside the region had never had reason to think about before that October morning. She'd been waiting outside her apartment building for a car she'd requested to take her to a lease signing appointment across town, the kind of small, mundane errand that fills the space between the parts of a life anyone bothers to remember later. Security footage from a coffee shop across the street caught her getting into a dark sedan at 2:11 p.m. It did not catch a license plate. It caught, at a distance and an angle bad enough to argue about in court later, 4 or 5 seconds of a woman climbing into a car that was not, as it turned out, the car she'd actually requested, and then it caught nothing else at all, because Kasia Nawak was never seen on any camera by any known witness again. Grace was the case agent for 6 weeks by the time an informant walked into the picture. And those 6 weeks had cost her more sleep than any case she could remember working, not because the investigation had gone badly, exactly, but because it had gone nowhere, which was its own particular kind of bad. The department had thrown real resources at it. Cell tower dumps, a reconstructed timeline down to the minute, a tip line that had generated 1,100 calls, and not one that led anywhere real. And at the end of 6 weeks, the single strongest piece of physical evidence anyone had was a grainy 4 seconds of a woman disappearing into a car nobody could identify. Local news had picked the story up within the first 48 hours and never fully let it go, running periodic updates that mostly amounted to nothing new to report. A phrase Grace came to dread, seeing on a chyron more than almost any other combination of words in the English language, because she understood exactly how it read to a family checking the coverage from 6,000 miles away, hoping every single time for a sentence that never came. Grace had a rule she'd built her whole career around and repeated to junior agents until it sounded like a mantra. Cases get solved by people, not evidence, because evidence has to be found, and people, eventually, if you wait long enough and are patient enough, tend to talk. She believed that rule. She had also, by week 6, started to genuinely worry it wasn't going to hold this time. She'd come up through the bureau the slower way. 6 years on a violent crime squad in a mid-sized field office before she ever got a case that made the national news cycle, and she'd built her reputation less on any single dramatic breakthrough than on a specific, unglamorous willingness to keep working a file long after other agents would have quietly let it slide toward the bottom of the stack. Her supervisor liked to say, not entirely as a compliment, that Grace treated every open case like a debt she personally owed someone, which was true enough that she'd stopped bothering to argue with it. She had, by her own private count, exactly one case in 11 years that had never closed, a teenager from her second year on the job whose file she still pulled out and reread every couple of years out of something that wasn't quite hope anymore. She thought about that file more than usual during the 6 weeks the Nowak case sat open, and she recognized, even at the time, that the thinking wasn't entirely healthy. The name Dale Sherrick surfaced in week 4 of the investigation, buried in a list of 31 registered vehicles, matching the general silhouette of the sedan from the coffee shop footage, and for most of that week he'd sat near the bottom of a long list of people worth a closer look. A physics doctoral candidate at Bellwood, 28 years old, no criminal record, a car that matched the shape but not, on closer inspection, a single confirmed detail beyond that. He'd grown up 2 hours from Ashford, the kind of quietly unremarkable upbringing that produced almost nothing for investigators to work with. No juvenile record, no documented history of violence. A handful of former classmates who described him, when agents eventually tracked them down, in terms so generic they were almost unsettling in their own right. Quiet, kept to himself, smart, a little intense about certain hobbies, but nothing anyone had ever thought to flag. He'd started the physics program 4 years earlier, with what his advisor described as real promise, and had spent the last 18 months of it drifting, missing meetings, falling behind on a dissertation nobody expected him to finish, the kind of slow academic unraveling that happened to enough graduate students every year that nobody around him had thought to read anything sinister into it. Agents interviewed his advisor twice in the course of the investigation, and both times came away with the same faintly unsettling impression. Not of a man anyone had actively worried about, but of a man nobody had actually noticed closely enough to worry about one way or the other. Exactly the kind of quiet middle distance a person can disappear into for years at a large university, without a single colleague ever forming a strong opinion about him in either direction. He had also, if he was honest, spent the last 18 months building something else nobody in his ordinary life had any visibility into at all. And it was only in retrospect, after Preeti Anand's analysis surfaced the deleted forum account, that anyone connected the quiet academic decline to a much darker and much more focused kind of attention he'd been paying elsewhere, in rooms nobody official had ever thought to check. What moved him up the list wasn't evidence. It was a pattern an analyst named Preeti Anand noticed almost by accident, cross-referencing campus forum activity against a since-deleted account that had, over the previous 18 months, posted with unsettling specificity about restraint methods, about vehicle interiors, about what it would take to make someone disappear cleanly from a town the size of Ashford without leaving a trace anyone could follow. The account had never named a target. It had never, technically, described a crime that had happened. It read, in the flat clinical language of someone working through a private fantasy, rather than confessing to anything real, and for most of the analysts who reviewed it, that ambiguity was exactly the problem. Enough to justify a closer look at Dale Sherrick, nowhere near enough to justify an arrest. He had a girlfriend. That detail sat in his background file for most of a week, before anyone treated it as more than a footnote. A woman named Dana Petrov, 24, a barista at a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus, who had been dating Dale Sherrick for a little over a year, and who showed up when agents finally worked up the nerve to approach her carefully, quietly terrified of something she hadn't been able to name to herself yet, let alone to anyone else. She hadn't come to them. Grace wanted to be honest about that part, both to her supervisors and to herself, because what happened next only made sense once you understood that Dana Petrov had not walked into a field office wanting to be a hero. Agents had approached her gently over the course of 2 conversations that took place 3 days apart, framed around nothing more alarming than her boyfriend's general behavior lately. Had he seemed different? Had he said anything that struck her as strange? And it was on the second of those conversations, sitting in her own car in a grocery store parking lot, with her hands shaking too hard to hold her coffee, that Dana told them about a night 2 weeks earlier, when Dale had come home late, agitated in a way she'd never seen from him before, and made a comment she hadn't been able to stop turning over in her head ever since. Something about how it was harder than people thought. Keeping something like that quiet harder than the shows made it look. She hadn't known, in the moment, what he meant. She'd told herself, in the 2 weeks since, a dozen different explanations that all sounded reasonable, and none of which she actually believed anymore. There was a week between that second conversation and the decision to move forward with a wire, where Grace and 2 other agents worked almost exclusively on quietly understanding Dana Petrov well enough to know whether what they were about to ask of her was something she could actually survive. They learned she'd grown up nearby, had no family of her own within 4 hours of Ashford, had been drifting somewhat aimlessly herself before the relationship with Dale gave her life a shape she'd been, by her own later admission, grateful for at the time. A detail that made the whole situation harder rather than easier, because it meant the man they were asking her to walk toward wearing a wire was not a stranger she'd have an easy time being afraid of in the abstract. He was someone she'd built an actual life around for over a year. She told them in that same conversation, met his mother twice, had spent a Christmas with his family the previous year, had genuinely, by every account she gave them, been planning a future with him right up until the night he came home agitated and said the thing she couldn't stop turning over since. A psychologist, the Bureau, consulted on the case, reviewing the transcripts of those early conversations, noted that Dana showed every sign of already suspecting something was deeply wrong and no clear framework yet for what to do about it. The specific, disorienting position of a person whose own instincts were telling her something her whole life with a partner was telling her to ignore. The decision to ask Dana Petrov to wear a wire was not made quickly, and it was not without real disagreement inside the office. And Grace, looking back on it later, understood that some of the loudest arguing in the room had been coming from her. The case for it was straightforward on paper. So, Dale Sherrick had confided in his girlfriend once already, unprompted, in a moment of what looked like genuine strain. The kind of slip that happened, in Grace's experience, most often to people who had done something they hadn't fully worked out how to carry alone, and who would, if given the right conditions, do it again. A memorial walk for Kasia Nowak had been organized by the university and the Polish Student Association for the following Saturday, drawing what the organizers expected to be several hundred people from campus and the wider town, and there was a real, documented behavioral pattern. One Grace had seen described in training more than once, and had never, until this case, expected to watch play out from the inside of a surveillance van, of offenders returning to spaces connected to their crime, drawn by something that wasn't guilt so much as its opposite, a need to stand inside the size of what they'd done and measure it against a crowd. The case against it was just as straightforward, and it came loudest from the unit's own risk assessment team, who pointed out correctly that Dana Petrov was not a trained operative, that she had no experience managing this kind of pressure, that placing a wire on a civilian and sending her into close physical proximity with a man they privately believed capable of exactly what he was suspected of doing, in a public setting they couldn't fully control, carried a level of risk the Bureau did not take on lightly. Grace had sat through that briefing and argued hard, in favor of moving forward anyway, and she'd spent a good deal of time in the months afterward being honest with herself about why. Some of it was sound investigative reasoning. The memorial gave them a narrow, unrepeatable window, a controlled public setting with agents already planning to be present in an official capacity regardless, and a subject with a documented history of the exact kind of unguarded talk they needed. But some of it, she knew, was also 6 weeks of a case that had given her nothing. 6 weeks of a family halfway around the world, calling the tip line themselves because they'd stopped trusting anyone to call them back. 6 weeks of wanting, badly, for there to finally be a person on the other end of all that silence, instead of just a description of a car. She had pushed for the operation because it was the right call. She had also pushed for it, if she was honest, because she needed it to be. They fitted Dana with the wire 2 days before the walk, in a hotel room 40 minutes outside Ashford, a technician working quietly, while Grace sat across from a 24-year-old woman who kept apologizing, unprompted, for her hands shaking too much to hold still. They rehearsed what she could say, and what she should never bring up first. Don't ask him anything. Don't lead him anywhere. Let him talk if he talks, and say nothing at all if he doesn't. And they gave her a phrase to use if she needed to leave immediately. A perfectly ordinary sentence about needing water that would sound like nothing to anyone standing near her, and would bring 3 agents to her side inside 90 seconds. They walked her through, twice, exactly where the device sat against her body, how long the battery would realistically last under continuous use, what to do if Dale asked to hold her, embrace her, put a hand anywhere near the small of her back where the pack sat. An answer that amounted, in the end, to nothing more reassuring than hoping he wouldn't, since there was no version of the placement that could survive a genuinely thorough search and still function at all. Grace remembers telling her, more than once, that she could back out at any point up until the moment the wire went live, that nobody would think less of her for it, and she remembers Dana looking at her and saying, in a voice steadier than her hands, that she didn't think she'd be able to live with herself if she didn't at least try. The walk began at 10 in the morning, under a sky the color of wet concrete. Several hundred people gathered on the university green, most of them holding candles that wouldn't be lit until dusk, and photocopied flyers with Kasia Nawak's face on them. Her actual smile, the specific unposed one from a photo her family had sent that had been on every local news broadcast for 6 weeks by that point. Grace sat in an unmarked van 2 blocks away with a headset clamped over one ear, a laptop open on her knees, showing a live waveform of the audio feed, and 2 other agents beside her, doing their best impression of people who weren't holding their breath. Agents in plainclothes had been threaded through the crowd since before 8 that morning, to ostensibly there in a routine capacity that university officials had actually requested given the scale of the event and the attention it had drawn, which gave the whole operation a layer of cover that made Grace, in hindsight, grateful for a piece of luck she hadn't fully appreciated at the time. Nobody in that crowd had any reason to look twice at a young woman standing near a folding table of memorial flyers with her boyfriend, or to notice the 4 men and women scattered at careful distances around her, who happened to glance her way more often than strangers usually do. Grace had walked the route herself the evening before, timing it, checking sightlines, identifying the 2 spots along the green where a hand signal would be visible to at least one agent from any angle. She'd told herself, doing it, that the preparation was standard procedure. She knew, doing it, that some of it was simply her own need to feel like she'd controlled every variable that could possibly be controlled in a situation where the one variable that actually mattered, what a man capable of what they believed Dale Sherrick capable of might do to a 24-year-old woman standing close enough to touch him, was never going to be one she could plan her way around completely. Dale Sherrick arrived at 10:40, alone, and for the first 11 minutes of audio, he said almost nothing at all. Small talk with people around him, a comment about the weather, the ordinary static of a young man standing in a crowd. Grace listened to that 11 minutes with a specific kind of dread she'd later have trouble describing to people who hadn't done this work. The dread of watching someone behave completely normally while knowing or believing you knew exactly what was sitting underneath the normal. At one point, he laughed at something someone near him said, an easy, unremarkable laugh, and Grace remembers the sound of it landing in her chest like something physical, the specific wrongness of a genuinely pleasant laugh coming from a man she was fairly certain had killed the person. Everyone around him had gathered to mourn. It was Dale. Brought it up, unprompted, the way the profile had said he might, standing near the edge of the crowd where Dana had steered them at Grace's earlier instruction, close enough to the flyers stacked on a folding table to see Kasia Nawak's face without either of them having to look at it directly. He asked Dana, in a tone Grace would later describe in her report as flat, almost bored, whether she thought there were more people here than the news vans were saying. He said it like a question about attendance at a concert. When Dana didn't immediately answer, he said something Grace has never fully been able to explain to anyone outside the job, that he'd been curious, coming here, how many people would actually show up for someone like her, and that the number, whatever it ended up being, was going to be the real headline, more than anything the police ever figured out. Dana asked him, her voice audibly unsteady, even through the compressed audio, what he meant by someone like her. What followed over the next several minutes was not delivered as a confession in the way television had trained Grace and everyone else in that van to expect one. No rising tension, no cracking voice, no moment of catharsis. Dale Sherrick described, in the same even, faintly self-satisfied register he'd used to ask about attendance figures, picking Kasia Nawak up in a car he'd modified to resemble a ride-share vehicle, closely enough that a person in a hurry wouldn't check twice. Described her fighting harder than he'd expected once she understood what was happening. Described restraining her, and, in language so clipped and procedural, it took Grace a full second to understand what she'd just heard. Described the specific method by which Kasia Nawak had died. He offered no justification for any of it, because he didn't seem to feel he owed anyone one. Grace has been asked, more than once in the years since, to describe what it was actually like to sit in that van and listen, and the honest answer she's never quite found the right words for is that the horror of it wasn't in any single detail so much as in the tone underneath all of them, the specific, level cadence of a man describing something he was, in some quiet and total way, proud of, the way another person might describe a difficult project finally finished on schedule. He paused, at one point, mid-description, to comment that a woman walking past the folding table looked like she was going to cry. Said it the way you'd narrate something happening on television, and then picked the thread of his own account back up exactly where he'd left it, without any apparent friction between the two registers. Grace remembers one of the agents beside her in the van reaching over, at that exact moment, and turning the volume down one notch on her own headset, not because it made the words any less audible, but because some instinct in the room needed the sound to be, however slightly, less close. When Dana, her voice barely holding together, asked if it had been the only time, he said no. He said it had happened before, more than once, and when Dana asked how many times, he told her 12, delivered with the same flat certainty as everything else he'd said that morning. No hesitation, no visible awareness that the number itself was an admission of something almost too large to process standing in a crowd of people mourning one of them. Whether that number was true, Grace still doesn't know. And neither, as far as she's aware, does anyone else who has ever worked this case. 12 is either the truth, or it's the kind of number a certain type of man reaches for specifically because it sounds impressive, rather than because it's accurate. A boast calibrated less to confess than to be believed capable of something enormous. Even at the cost of admitting to crimes, investigators would then be professionally obligated to spend years trying and mostly failing to substantiate. Grace has read the file on every unsolved disappearance within 400 miles of Ashford in the years before and after Dale Sherrick's arrest, more times than she can count, looking for the shape of 11 other women in among cases that, mostly when you looked closely, had far more mundane and far sadder explanations. She's found nothing that connects cleanly. She has also never been able to make herself believe he made the number up out of nothing. The last thing he said, the thing that ended up in every account of that day that ever reached the public afterward, was delivered as Dana asked him one final time whether anyone was ever going to find her. Dale Sherrick told her no. He said it the way a man states a fact he's confident in, not a threat, not a boast even, just a flat prediction he seemed to have complete faith in, that Cassia Nawak's body had been placed somewhere that guaranteed it, and that no amount of searching was ever going to change that. He was right, as it turned out, in every way that has mattered since. Cassia Nawak has never been found. Dana gave the signal 4 minutes later, and the extraction took under 3 agents moving through the edge of the crowd, with a practiced casualness that Grace watched on a second monitor, with her heart still not fully settled from what she just heard through the headset. Dana was placed in the back of an unmarked car, 2 streets over within 6 minutes of leaving Dale's side, and Grace remembers going back there herself, breaking protocol slightly to do it, and finding her sitting very still with her hands pressed flat against her own knees, not crying yet, in the specific held stillness of someone whose body hadn't caught up to what had just happened to it. She asked Grace before anything else whether they'd gotten it, whether the recorder had actually worked. And when Grace told her yes, she nodded once, and then, several seconds later, began to shake in a way that didn't stop for what the agent riding with her back to the field office estimated was close to 20 minutes. He was not arrested that day. The decision made above Grace's rank in a series of calls that happened over the following 72 hours was to build the case around the recording carefully, rather than move immediately, gathering corroborating evidence. Cell tower data, placing his phone near a rural stretch of state land the department had never previously flagged. A receipt for cleaning supplies purchased 2 days after the disappearance, fibers recovered from his vehicle that would take the forensic lab 3 more weeks to process, before an arrest that came, eventually, 17 days after the memorial walk, executed quietly at his apartment on a Tuesday morning, with no press present and no warning given. Those 17 days were, by Grace's own account, some of the tensest of her career, not because anyone seriously doubted the recording's substance, but because a confession obtained through an informant operation still had to survive contact with a defense attorney who would spend the better part of a year trying to find any seam in it worth pulling on. Grace spent much of that window doing the unglamorous work of shoring up every piece of physical evidence that could stand independently of Dana's testimony, aware the whole time that Dale Sherrick was walking around free, teaching a discussion section, buying groceries, behaving by every outward measure like a man with nothing at all to hide, while a small task force worked 18-hour days trying to make sure the case against him would be airtight enough to survive whatever his defense eventually threw at it. Surveillance on him during that window was constant and, for the agents assigned to it, deeply unpleasant in a way none of them fully articulated to each other at the time. Watching a man they'd heard confess in his own voice go about an entirely ordinary week, checking his mail, returning library books, waiting at a crosswalk with the same patience as everyone else, while 11 claimed and unconfirmed disappearances sat somewhere behind his eyes with no visible weight to them at all. He was convicted 14 months later, after a trial that Grace sat through nearly every day of, on charges related solely to the death of Kasia Nawak, the only case prosecutors were ever able to build to a standard that would hold in court. The defense had tried, in the months leading up to trial, to have the recording excluded entirely, arguing over 3 separate hearings that the operation had crossed lines around informant coercion, and that Donna Petrov's own emotional state at the time undermined the reliability of anything captured. Arguments a federal judge rejected in a written opinion that Grace kept a printed copy of in her desk for years afterward, less out of professional pride than because rereading it on bad days reminded her that the process, at least in this one instance, had actually held. The recording from the memorial walk was played for the jury in full, and Grace watched from the gallery, several jurors visibly unable to keep their composure through the section where Dale Sherrick described attendance figures like a man checkbox office returns. One juror, a middle-aged man in the second row, closed his eyes for nearly the entire 11-minute segment and kept them closed for several minutes after the recording had stopped, as though needing that much time to arrange his face back into something he was willing to let the courtroom see. Dale Sherrick himself sat through the playback without any visible reaction Grace could identify from where she sat, which several reporters covering the trial remarked on afterward as its own kind of testimony. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, the jury having deadlocked during the sentencing phase on whether to pursue the death penalty, an outcome that left both the prosecution and Kasia Nawak's family with the specific, unsatisfying closure of a punishment that would keep him confined for the rest of his life without ever requiring him to face the fuller reckoning some of them had hoped for. He has never, in the years since, offered any further information about the other 11 women he claimed that morning to have killed, and he has declined, through counsel, every request for a follow-up interview that investigators, journalists, and eventually true crime researchers with no official standing at all have sent his way. Investigators have never closed the door on the possibility that the number was real, and they have also, after years of trying, never opened it any further than the single flat number, Dana Petrov, carried out of that crowd on a wire meant to hold 6 hours of battery and barely 40 minutes of the only evidence that would ever matter. Dana Petrov left Ashford within a year of the trial's end and asked, through the victim witness coordinator, who stayed in occasional contact with her, that her actual name never appear in any public account of the case. A request Grace has honored in every version of this story she's ever told since, including this one, and one of the reasons every other name in this account has been changed as well. What Grace understands about what that morning cost her comes secondhand, filtered through a coordinator's careful updates over the years. That she left the relationship, obviously, and left the state, and spent a long time afterward unable to be in any kind of crowd without needing to know immediately where every exit was. She'd gone back to school eventually, according to the last update Grace had received, studying something entirely unrelated to anything from her old life, and had told the coordinator in one of their last conversations that she still sometimes woke up certain she could hear his voice in the room with her, flat and unhurried, describing something in that same terrible, even register, before her own bedroom resolved itself back into just a bedroom. Grace has never spoken to her again directly. She thinks about her more than she'd like to admit, usually on the anniversary of the walk. Usually around the same hour of the morning the recording begins. There is a particular kind of guilt that comes with having asked someone to do something that worked exactly as intended, and cost them everything anyway. And Grace has never fully found language for it, beyond acknowledging that it exists and doesn't go away on any predictable schedule. She has read every psychological evaluation the Bureau commissioned on Dana in the 2 years following the trial, has sat through more than one meeting where senior agents discussed, in the clinical language such meetings require, whether the operation represented an acceptable use of a civilian informant given what it ultimately cost her, and has never once, in any of those conversations, heard anyone reach a conclusion Grace found fully satisfying in either direction. The case got solved. A man who would very likely have killed again was taken permanently off the street. A 24-year-old woman who had wanted, more than anything, to do the right thing by a stranger she'd never met had also, by every account available to Grace since, never fully recovered the life she'd had before agents first approached her in a grocery store parking lot. Kasia Nowak's parents flew from Poland for the trial and sat through every day of testimony, including the day the recording was played, and Grace still remembers watching Kasia's mother in the gallery during the section about attendance figures, her face doing something that wasn't quite crying, closer to the specific stillness of a person absorbing a wound too large to process in real time. Kasia's father sat beside her without moving for the entire 11 minutes, and it was only afterward, in the hallway during a recess, that Grace saw him step away from his wife and press both hands flat against a wall for what must have been close to a minute, the posture of a man bracing himself against something with actual physical weight to it. They spoke almost no English between them, and had relied for most of the trial on a translator provided by the Victim Witness Program. A young woman roughly Kasia's own age, who Grace watched grow visibly more exhausted, day by day, from the specific burden of having to render every detail of the recording into a language the parents could understand without softening any of it in the process. They asked Grace, afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, The same question every family in her 11 years on this job has eventually asked her in one form or another, whether they would ever be able to bring their daughter home. Grace told them the truth, because she'd learned, over those 11 years, that anything else was its own kind of cruelty. She told them the search would never officially close. That state land near the coordinates his phone had pinged in the days after the disappearance had already been searched twice with cadaver dogs and would be searched again if any new information ever surfaced. That the file would remain open for as long as she had anything to do with it. She did not tell them what she actually believed, which was that Dale Sherrick had almost certainly told the truth about that one detail if nothing else, and that some searches, however long they're kept technically open, are being conducted for the family's sake, rather than because anyone still expects them to find anything at all. Kezia's mother held both of Grace's hands in the hallway that day, and thanked her. In careful rehearsed English, she'd clearly practiced for exactly that moment, and Grace has never been able to decide, in the years since, whether accepting that gratitude without correcting it was the right thing to have done. She still works missing persons cases, still carrying the same rule she started with, that cases get solved by people, not evidence, though she's learned to hold it more carefully now than she did in her first few years on the job. She still, more than she'd like, catches herself doing the math on a stranger's car matching a description, on a crowd at a public gathering, on the specific, particular stillness of a person standing in a group of mourners, who seems, for reasons she couldn't articulate to a jury, to be enjoying himself more than the moment should allow. She has never again run an operation quite like the one at Bellwood's Memorial Walk. Not because it failed, it worked. In every sense, the job measures success. But because she has never since been fully able to convince herself that 11 other women aren't still sitting somewhere in an unsolved file, waiting on a number she has no way of proving true and no way, after everything, of making herself disbelieve. Every few months, usually without any particular trigger she can point to afterward, Grace pulls the Nowak file again, not because there's anything new in it, there almost never is, but because the specific discipline of going back through it, page by page, has become the closest thing she has to a ritual for holding the case the way she believes it deserves to be held. She rereads the transcript of the recording every time, all 40 minutes of it, in full, even though she could recite long stretches of it from memory by now, because she's never been willing to let herself get comfortable enough with the words that they stop landing the way they're supposed to. She keeps in the same drawer as the judge's written ruling on the recording's admissibility a single printed photograph of Kasia Nowak that isn't the one that ran on the news. A candid a friend had submitted to the file during the investigation. Kasia laughing at something off camera, unposed, unaware that a photograph existed of her doing something as small and ordinary as laughing, that would, within a few years, end up filed alongside a killer's confession in a federal agent's desk drawer, 4,000 miles from where it was taken. Grace doesn't know, and has stopped expecting to ever know, whether the number 12 was real. What she does know, what she thinks about on the drive home most of the nights she pulls that file, is that the not knowing is its own kind of ongoing harm, distributed unevenly across a set of families who have no idea their names might belong somewhere in a case file they've never heard of, built around a number a dying case still can't confirm or dismiss. Somewhere, she suspects, there is at least one other family still checking a phone that never rings, still waiting on a daughter or a sister or a wife whose disappearance never got connected to anything, filed instead under whatever mundane explanation the local department reached for first, because nobody ever had reason to imagine the alternative. She hopes, on the nights she lets herself hope about it at all, that she's wrong. She has never been able to make herself believe it, and she has stopped, in recent years, expecting that to change.